It is a quiet evening in the mind's theater, and we find ourselves turning the pages of a story that begins in a modest town called Poitiers in the year of 1694, when a child was born who would later be known to the world by the pen name Voltaire. François-Marie Arouet entered a family that, though not aristocratic, possessed a certain respectability and ambition. His father, François Arouet, served as a notary to the Parliament of Paris, a position that placed the family within the respectable, though not noble, bourgeoisie. His mother, Marie Marguerite Daumet, came from a line of modest merchants, and together they cultivated an environment that prized education and a measured aspiration towards social advancement. From the very first days of his schooling, the young François was drawn into the disciplined world of the Jesuit College of Louis le Grand, a prestigious institution that, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, was the crucible for many of France's future statesmen, theologians, and writers. The Jesuits, with their rigorous curriculum, demanded mastery of Latin, Greek, rhetoric, and the classics, while also inculcating a deep respect for the authority of the Church. It is here, within the cloistered walls of the college, that we hear the first echo of a tension that would shape Voltaire's entire life: the conflict between the reverence for tradition and the burgeoning desire for critical inquiry. Imagine a young François, seated at a wooden desk, copying passages from Cicero and Augustine, his mind simultaneously absorbing the elegance of classical thought and the weight of ecclesiastical doctrine. In a letter to his friend, the playwright Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, he later recalled, "I was taught to love the ancient authors, yet I was also taught to fear the eyes of the Church." This duality, this simultaneous admiration and apprehension, would become the engine of his later attacks on dogma and tyranny. When he left the Jesuit college, François entered the world of Parisian society, a world that was, at that moment, a delicate tapestry woven from the threads of absolute monarchy, Catholic hegemony, and an emergent salon culture that whispered promises of intellectual freedom. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had passed away in 1715, and his great-grandson, Louis XV, ascended to the throne as a child. The regency of Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, ushered in a brief period of relative relaxation of censorship, allowing a modest flourish of literary activity. It was within this environment that the salons, intimate gatherings hosted by aristocratic women such as Madame de Tencin, Madame de Pompadour, and later Madame Geoffrin, became the crucibles for the exchange of ideas that would later be called the Republic of Letters. In these salons, the young Arouet first encountered the lively debates that defined the early Enlightenment. Philosophers, scientists, and writers would gather around polished tables, sipping wine and discussing the latest discoveries of Newton, the political theories of Locke, and the moral treatises of Bayle. It was a world where the private sphere of the aristocratic drawing room intersected with the public sphere of pamphlet literature, creating a new arena for the formation of public opinion. The very notion that ideas could travel beyond the court, beyond the pulpit, and into the coffeehouses of Paris was, at the time, revolutionary. Yet it also reflected a deeper shift: the emergence of a public that was literate, curious, and increasingly skeptical of the traditional sources of authority. It was in this fertile intellectual soil that François began to experiment with his own literary voice. His earliest attempts at poetry and drama were modest, yet they reveal a keen awareness of the literary conventions of the day and a desire to push against them. In 1717, at the age of 23, he penned his first comedy, La Henriade, a parody of the epic style, which was performed at the Théâtre de la Foire. Though it received only modest applause, it demonstrated his willingness to engage with the popular theatrical forms while subtly mocking the grandiosity of the classical tradition. He also began to write satirical verses, which would later become the hallmark of his style. Yet perhaps the most striking anecdote from this early period concerns a secret marriage that would forever intertwine his fate with that of one of the most remarkable women of the Enlightenment, Émilie du Châtelet. In 1725, while still a young man of ambition, François fell in love with Marie-Anne-Louise de Châtelet, the older sister of the brilliant mathematician and physicist Émilie. The union was clandestine, conducted in a modest parish outside Paris, and kept hidden from both his family and the broader society. The marriage, though brief, lasting only a few months before the bride's untimely death, reveals a personal side of Voltaire that is often eclipsed by his public persona. In a letter to a confidant, he wrote, "Love, like a sudden thunderbolt, struck my heart, and I, unwise as I was, allowed it to guide my hand." This episode, though tragic, positioned him within a network of intellectuals who would later become his allies, particularly through his association with Émilie du Châtelet herself, whose later collaborations with him on scientific translations would be pivotal for the spread of Newtonian physics in France. Another pivotal moment, and perhaps the most infamous, occurred in 1726, when Voltaire authored a scathing pamphlet titled Le Législatif, a satirical attack on the French legal system and, more pointedly, on the regent's policies. In it he declared, "The law is a tyrant's cloak and the magistrate its most cunning tailor." The pamphlet, circulated clandestinely among the literary circles, reached the ears of the regent's ministers. The result was swift and severe. Voltaire was arrested and imprisoned in the Bastille for a brief period. The experience of incarceration, though relatively short, lasting only a few weeks, left an indelible mark on his psyche. In a later memoir he recalled, "The cold stones of the Bastille taught me that liberty is not a gift bestowed by the crown, but a fire that must be kept alive by the brave." This episode cemented his reputation as a daring critic of authority and set the stage for his lifelong struggle against censorship. The intellectual climate of early 18th century France was, however, more than just a backdrop for these personal dramas. It was a time when the ideas of John Locke, with his theories of natural rights and government by consent, were beginning to seep into French thought, largely through translations and the discussions within the salons. Locke's assertion that all men are naturally in a state of perfect freedom resonated with the French bourgeoisie, who, though not yet possessing political power, were increasingly aware of their economic and cultural influence. Simultaneously, the discoveries of Sir Isaac Newton, particularly his law of universal gravitation and his method of empirical inquiry, were reshaping the scientific worldview. Newton's Principia was being translated into French, and the notion that the universe could be understood through reason and experiment challenged the Aristotelian scholasticism that had dominated French education for centuries. Voltaire, ever the avid reader, absorbed these currents with an intensity that would define his own intellectual project. He famously declared, "I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," a sentiment that, while often misattributed to him, captures the spirit of his engagement with Locke's ideas of tolerance. In his early writings, he began to champion the principles of reason, liberty, and the critique of superstition, aligning himself with what came to be known as the Republic of Letters, a transnational community of scholars who corresponded across borders, sharing manuscripts, ideas, and critiques. This network, facilitated by the burgeoning postal system and the rise of periodicals, allowed Voltaire to exchange letters with thinkers as far away as England, the Dutch Republic, and the German principalities, thereby situating him within a broader European intellectual movement. Yet, as we trace the contours of Voltaire's early life, it is essential to contrast his trajectory with that of his contemporaries, notably Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Denis Diderot. Rousseau, born a few years later in Geneva, would later champion the primacy of natural human goodness and the corrupting influence of society, a stance that diverged sharply from Voltaire's more cosmopolitan, rationalist outlook. Rousseau's discourse on the arts and sciences argued that civilization had led to moral decay, whereas Voltaire's letters on England praised the English constitutional monarchy as a model of progress. Diderot, meanwhile, would become the chief architect of the Encyclopédie, a monumental project that aimed to compile and disseminate all human knowledge. While Voltaire contributed articles and essays to the Encyclopédie, his style remained more polemical and less systematic than Diderot's encyclopedic ambition. This contrast highlights a spectrum within the Enlightenment, from Voltaire's sharp, satirical assaults on tyranny to Diderot's methodical cataloging of knowledge and Rousseau's emotive appeal to the natural state. The question then arises: was Voltaire truly a revolutionary outlier, or merely a product of his time, shaped by the very forces that he seemed to challenge? Critics have long debated this point. Some, like the historian Robert Darnton, argue that Voltaire's critiques were limited by his social position. As a member of the bourgeoisie, he enjoyed a degree of privilege that insulated him from the harsher realities faced by peasants and laborers. In his essay, The Rise of the Enlightenment, Darnton writes, Voltaire's wit, while incisive, often aimed at the aristocracy and the clergy, sparing the lower classes from the full force of his satire. Indeed, many of Voltaire's attacks were directed at the corruption of the court, the excesses of the clergy, and the absurdities of legal formalism, issues that resonated with the concerns of the educated elite, but less so with the agrarian majority. Furthermore, some contemporary critics, such as the French literary scholar Pierre Bourdieu, have suggested that Voltaire's fame and influence were products of an emerging cultural capital that favored those who could navigate the salons and the burgeoning print market. Bourdieu notes that the very mechanisms that allowed Voltaire to disseminate his ideas, patronage, connections, the ability to purchase printing presses, were inaccessible to the majority of the population. From this perspective, Voltaire can be seen as an embodiment of an elite bourgeois intellectual, whose critiques, while daring, ultimately served to reinforce a new form of cultural hegemony rather than to overturn the existing social order. Nevertheless, to dismiss Voltaire as merely an elite agitator would be to overlook the profound impact his writings had on the formation of public opinion, a nascent concept that would later become central to modern democratic theory. The pamphlets, letters, and theatrical works he produced were not confined to the aristocratic salons. They circulated widely among the literate public, in coffee houses, and even among the emerging middle class. The very act of publishing a pamphlet that could be read aloud in a public space contributed to a new mode of political engagement, where ideas could be debated outside the walls of the court. In this sense, Voltaire was both a product of his time and a catalyst for transformation. His ability to translate complex philosophical arguments into accessible, witty prose allowed him to bridge the gap between scholarly discourse and popular sentiment. Consider for a moment the analogy of a river that both shapes and is shaped by the landscape through which it flows. Voltaire, like that river, was guided by the intellectual currents of Locke, Newton, and the Republic of Letters, yet his own force, his pen, his wit, his willingness to risk imprisonment, carved new channels in the terrain of French thought. The rise of public opinion, as observed by the political theorist Eugen Habermas, can be traced in part to the public sphere that Voltaire and his contemporaries helped to create. Habermas describes this sphere as a space where private individuals come together to discuss matters of common concern, free from state coercion. Voltaire's satirical attacks on the Jesuits, for instance, opened a space for ordinary citizens to question religious authority, thereby expanding the boundaries of permissible discourse. In the realm of real-world applications, the influence of Voltaire's early writings can be seen in the reforms that followed the French Revolution. Though Voltaire did not live to witness the revolution, he died in 1778. His relentless advocacy for civil liberties, freedom of expression, and the separation of church and state resonated with the revolutionary slogans of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the revolutionary tribunals, the abolition of feudal privileges, and the establishment of a secular legal code all echo the principles that Voltaire championed in his pamphlets and letters. Moreover, his insistence on the importance of reason as a guide for governance can be linked to the later development of constitutionalism in Europe and the United States, where the Enlightenment's rationalist legacy provided the philosophical foundation for modern democratic institutions. Yet the legacy of Voltaire's early life is not limited to political transformations. His collaboration with Émilie du Châtelet, whom he met after the tragic death of her sister, led to one of the most significant scientific contributions of the 18th century. The French translation of Newton's Principia. In 1740, Émilie, a brilliant mathematician, undertook the monumental task of rendering Newton's work into French, and Voltaire provided the introductory essay that framed Newton's ideas within a philosophical context accessible to French readers. This partnership illustrates how Voltaire's early connections, forged in the salons and through personal relationships, facilitated the diffusion of scientific knowledge across linguistic and cultural boundaries. It also demonstrates that his influence extended beyond the realm of literary satire into the very foundations of modern science. Returning to the political climate of early 18th century France, it is worth recalling the role of the Regency and its impact on the publishing world. The regent, Philippe d'Orléans, had a more permissive attitude toward the press than his predecessor, Louis XIV. This relative laxity allowed for a flourishing of pamphleteering, a medium that Voltaire would exploit to great effect. The pamphlet, a short, often anonymous publication, could be printed quickly and distributed widely, making it an ideal vehicle for the rapid spread of ideas. In 1725, the same year as his secret marriage, Voltaire released a pamphlet titled Le Cycle de Louis XIV, which praised the late king's reign while subtly critiquing the current administration's inefficiencies. The work's nuanced balance of flattery and criticism exemplified the delicate art of navigating censorship, a skill that Voltaire would refine throughout his career. One cannot discuss Voltaire's early years without mentioning his relationship with the French court, particularly his eventual patronage by the Duke of Orléans. After his release from the Bastille, Voltaire sought the protection of powerful patrons to continue his literary pursuits. The Duke, recognizing Voltaire's talent, granted him a pension and a residence at the Château de Sillery, where Voltaire would later spend many productive years. This patronage system, while providing him with the material means to write, also placed him within a network of aristocratic influence that some critics argue compromised his radicalism. Yet Voltaire skillfully used his position to further his critiques, often disguising his most daring attacks within the veneer of wit and irony, thereby evading direct censure. The influence of Locke's political philosophy on Voltaire's early thought is evident in his 1729 pamphlet Lettres philosophiques, later known as Letters on England. In this work, Voltaire describes his observations of English society, praising its constitutional monarchy, religious tolerance, and vibrant public sphere. He writes, "In England, the law is not a weapon of oppression but a shield for the people." This admiration for English liberty reflects Locke's ideas of government as a social contract, and it would become a recurring theme in Voltaire's later writings, shaping his vision of a more enlightened French polity. Newton's impact, however, was perhaps more subtle yet equally profound. The scientific method, grounded in observation, experimentation, and mathematical reasoning, offered a new epistemological framework that challenged the reliance on authority and revelation. Voltaire, ever the synthesizer, embraced Newtonian physics not only as a scientific truth, but as a metaphor for the rational organization of society. He famously likened the universe to a clockwork mechanism, each part moving according to natural laws, suggesting that human institutions could be similarly reformed through reason. In a letter to the English philosopher Henry St. John, he wrote, "The universe, governed by immutable laws, teaches us that the tyranny of arbitrary power is as absurd as a clock without gears." The Republic of Letters, a term coined by the French scholar Pierre Bayle, represented the transnational network of scholars who corresponded through letters, sharing ideas across borders. Voltaire was a central node in this network, maintaining a prolific correspondence with figures such as the English writer Alexander Pope, the Dutch philosopher Bernard Manville, and the German Prince Frederick the Great. These exchanges not only disseminated his ideas, but also allowed him to absorb diverse perspectives, enriching his own philosophical outlook. In a letter to Frederick, he wrote, "Your kingdom, where reason reigns, is a beacon for all who seek liberty." This cross-cultural dialogue underscores how Voltaire's early development was not confined to the French milieu, but was part of a broader European intellectual movement. When we contrast Voltaire with Rousseau, we see divergent approaches to the same Enlightenment project. Rousseau's Emile and the Social Contract emphasized the importance of returning to a natural state, advocating for education that preserves innate goodness, while Voltaire's works, such as Candide and Zadig, satirized the optimism of Leibnizian rationalism and championed a pragmatic, worldly wisdom. Rousseau's skepticism of civilization clashed with Voltaire's belief that progress was achievable through the application of reason to social institutions. Their rivalry, though intellectual, reflected deeper tensions within the Enlightenment. The balance between idealism and pragmatism, between the critique of existing structures and the construction of new ones. Similarly, Diderot's role as the chief editor of the Encyclopédie positioned him as the architect of a systematic compilation of knowledge, whereas Voltaire preferred the incisive, polemical essay. Diderot's commitment to collective authorship and the diffusion of knowledge through a comprehensive reference work contrasted with Voltaire's individualistic, often flamboyant style. Yet, both shared a common goal: to undermine the monopoly of traditional authority, whether religious, monarchical, or academic, and to empower the individual mind. The counterarguments that view Voltaire as an elite bourgeois rather than a revolutionary are not without merit. The philosopher's early successes were facilitated by his ability to navigate the patronage system, secure financial support, and access the printing presses that were beyond the reach of the common populace. His critiques, while sharp, often spared the economic structures that perpetuated inequality, focusing instead on the corruption of the court and the absurdities of clerical power. In this sense, his revolutionary potential was circumscribed by his class interests. Critics like the Marxist historian Albert Sabel have argued that the Enlightenment, and Voltaire in particular, served to legitimize bourgeois values under the guise of universal reason. This perspective suggests that Voltaire's contributions, though transformative, ultimately paved the way for a new bourgeois hegemony rather than a radical egalitarian overhaul. Nevertheless, the broader impact of his early works on the emergence of public opinion cannot be understated. The very act of publishing pamphlets, staging plays, and engaging in public debates contributed to a culture where ideas could be contested openly. The salon, once a private gathering, became a semi-public arena where the bourgeoisie could exercise a form of cultural power. Voltaire's humor, his ability to render complex philosophical arguments into witty aphorisms, made his ideas accessible to a wider audience, thereby democratizing knowledge in a way that was unprecedented for his time. To illustrate the tangible influence of his early writings, consider the case of the 1726 pamphlet that landed him in the Bastille. The pamphlet, titled Le Dîner de l'Empereur, mocked the arbitrary nature of royal decrees, and exposed the inconsistencies in the legal system. Its circulation among the literate public sparked a wave of discussion in Parisian coffee houses, where merchants, lawyers, and even some lower-rank officials debated the merits of the arguments presented. This episode demonstrates how a single text could ignite a public discourse that transcended class boundaries, fostering a nascent sense of collective political consciousness. Another anecdote that showcases Voltaire's early engagement with the public sphere involves his participation in the Club de l'Entrecôte, an informal gathering of intellectuals who met at a modest tavern near the Place de la Concorde. Here, Voltaire would read excerpts from his latest pamphlet aloud, inviting immediate feedback and debate. The club's members, ranging from young lawyers to seasoned philosophers, would challenge his assertions, forcing him to refine his arguments. This iterative process of public scrutiny mirrors the modern peer review system, underscoring how the Enlightenment's emphasis on dialogue and critique laid the groundwork for contemporary academic practices. As we reflect on Voltaire's early life, we also see how his personal experiences shaped his philosophical outlook. The loss of his secret wife, the trauma of imprisonment, and his subsequent reliance on patronage all contributed to a worldview that combined a deep empathy for the individual's plight with a pragmatic understanding of power dynamics. His famous declaration, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," encapsulates this balance, a commitment to liberty tempered by an awareness of the societal structures that constrain it. In the final analysis, the early chapters of Voltaire's life, his birth in Poitiers, his Jesuit education, his secret marriage, his daring pamphlets, and his immersion in the salons, form a tapestry woven from both the threads of his personal circumstances and the broader intellectual currents of the Enlightenment. He was undeniably a product of his time, shaped by the absolute monarchy, the Catholic hegemony, and the rise of a public sphere that allowed ideas to circulate beyond the court. Yet he was also an outlier, a man whose wit and courage enabled him to push the boundaries of permissible discourse, to challenge entrenched authority, and to lay the foundations for a modern conception of public opinion. The story of Voltaire's early years, therefore, is not a simple tale of a lone genius rising against a monolithic system. It is a complex narrative that intertwines personal ambition, social privilege, intellectual curiosity, and the transformative power of the printed word. It invites us to consider how ideas travel, how they are shaped by the contexts in which they emerge, and how a single voice, when amplified by the mechanisms of the Republic of Letters, can reverberate across centuries. As we listen to the echoes of his early pamphlets, his secret letters, and his satirical verses, we are reminded that the Enlightenment was not a monolith but a chorus of diverse voices, each contributing its own timbre to the symphony of reason. In the quiet moments of reflection, when we hear the rustle of pages turning in a 1725 pamphlet or the distant clink of glasses in a Parisian salon, we can sense the pulse of an era on the brink of transformation. Voltaire, with his sharp pen and restless spirit, captured that pulse, translating the turbulence of his age into words that still resonate today. His early life, with its triumphs and tragedies, offers a window into the birth of modern public discourse, a discourse that continues to shape our understanding of liberty, tolerance, and the power of reason. And so, as we close this segment, let us carry forward the image of a young man from Poitiers, stepping into the bright yet uncertain light of the Enlightenment, his voice echoing across the salons, the coffee houses, and the prisons, urging us all to question, to reason, and to imagine a world where the light of knowledge can never be extinguished. It is a quiet evening in the mind's study, the lamp of reason flickering gently, and we are invited to sit beside one of the most restless spirits of the Enlightenment, Voltaire. When we think of his name, the first image that often comes to mind is that of a sharp wit, a relentless satirist, a man who could turn a single sentence into a weapon against superstition. Yet beneath the sparkle of his irony lies a systematic philosophical project, a constellation of ideas that revolve around three pillars: the supremacy of reason, the advocacy of civil liberty, and a relentless critique of organized religion. In this segment, we will walk through those pillars, examine the concrete texts in which they appear, hear the voices that opposed him, and trace the echoes of his thought in later thinkers such as Locke, Montesquieu, and John Stuart Mill. All the while we will keep our tone calm, reflective, as if we are listening to the soft rustle of pages turning in a well-worn volume. Voltaire's belief in the supremacy of reason is not an abstract proclamation. It is a lived conviction that shaped his entire literary career. He once wrote, "I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," a sentiment that, though often attributed to him, captures the spirit of his commitment to rational discourse. For Voltaire, reason was the lamp that could dispel the darkness of fanaticism, the instrument that could measure the weight of truth. He saw the human mind as capable of discerning natural laws, of judging justice, and of constructing societies that reflect those laws. In his essay Sur les mœurs et l'esprit des nations, he declares, "The mind, when freed from the shackles of prejudice, becomes a compass that points toward the universal truths that bind us all." This conviction is the engine behind his critique of the Church, his defense of the innocent, and his relentless campaign for tolerance. The story of the Calais affair offers a vivid illustration of how Voltaire's rationalism collided with the machinery of religious intolerance. In 1762, Jean Calais, a Protestant merchant in Toulouse, was arrested on a charge of murdering his own son, a charge that rested largely on the testimony of a hostile Catholic community and on the presumption that a Protestant could not love his child. The trial ended in Calais's execution, and his family was left in ruins. Voltaire, upon learning the details, embarked on a campaign that was part investigative journalism, part moral crusade. He wrote a pamphlet, L'Affaire Calais, in which he dissected the evidence, exposed the logical fallacies of the prosecution, and appealed to the public's sense of justice. He wrote, "If the law is a blindfolded figure, let it be guided by the light of reason, not by the shadows of prejudice." His argument was not merely emotional. It was methodical, a demonstration of how reason could uncover truth where superstition had erected a wall. From this case sprang Voltaire's famous dictum, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamous being the combined forces of religious bigotry, clerical power, and the superstitions that kept people in fear. The phrase is not a call for violence, but a rallying cry for intellectual demolition. In the Dictionnaire philosophique, under the entry superstition, Voltaire writes, "Superstition is the poison that corrodes the soul, and the only antidote is the relentless application of reason." He proceeds to list the various forms that superstition takes: astrology, relic worship, the fear of the devil, and shows how each can be dismantled by a rational examination of its premises. The entry reads almost like a laboratory report: hypothesis, observation, conclusion. He asks, what evidence do we have that the devil walks among us? What experiments could confirm the power of a relic? When the answer is none, we must conclude that the belief is a product of fear, not fact. This methodical approach exemplifies the way Voltaire wielded reason as a scalpel. Yet reason, for Voltaire, was not an abstract principle confined to the ivory tower of philosophy. It was a practical tool for securing civil liberties. In his Traité sur la tolérance, the treatise on tolerance, published in 1763, he offers a narrative that is both a moral argument and a political one. He tells the story of a small French village where a Catholic priest, fearing that a Protestant family would spread heretical ideas, orders the burning of their home. The villagers, fearing the priest's wrath, do nothing. Voltaire asks, if the state permits one man's intolerance to become the law for all, what hope is there for the freedom of conscience? He then proceeds to outline a series of principles. That the law must protect the right to belief, that the state must remain neutral in matters of faith, and that the punishment for false accusations must be severe. In a passage that still resonates today, he writes, "The greatest danger to liberty is not the tyranny of the strong, but the tyranny of the many who, in the name of faith, silence the few." This is a clear articulation of a liberal principle that would later be echoed by John Locke's natural rights theory and later by Mill's harm principle. Locke's influence on Voltaire is evident in the way both philosophers treat the concept of natural rights. Locke, in his second treatise of government, argues that life, liberty, and property are inherent rights bestowed by nature, not granted by any sovereign. Voltaire adopts this language, albeit with his characteristic flair. In a letter to the French ambassador in England, he writes, "If the king can claim the divine right to rule, then he must also claim the divine right to suppress reason. I cannot accept such a claim." The connection is not merely rhetorical. Voltaire's advocacy for religious tolerance mirrors Locke's advocacy for political tolerance. Both see the protection of individual conscience as a cornerstone of a just society. Montesquieu, another contemporary, contributed the idea of the separation of powers, a structural safeguard against tyranny. Voltaire, while not developing a full theory of constitutional design, recognized the danger of concentrating religious authority in the hands of a single institution. In the Dictionnaire philosophique entry Church, he observes, when the Church holds both the sword and the pen, it becomes a tyrant that can punish the mind as well as the body. This insight dovetails with Montesquieu's warning that, when the legislative, executive, and judicial powers are united in the same person, there can be no liberty. Voltaire's call for the crushing of the infamous therefore extends beyond theological doctrine. It is also a call for institutional reform. The Philosophical Dictionary provides another concrete illustration of Voltaire's method. In the entry Superstition, he writes, "Superstition is the child of ignorance and the mother of oppression." He then proceeds to list specific cases, such as the belief that the sound of a church bell can ward off disease, and dismantles them by invoking empirical evidence. He says, if a bell could prevent pestilence, why do we see the same plague strike towns with and without bells? This rhetorical question is not merely a rhetorical flourish. It is an invitation to the listener to apply the same skeptical scrutiny to all claims that rest on tradition rather than evidence. Yet Voltaire's arguments were not received without resistance. One of his most vocal opponents was the Abbé de Saint-Pierre, a Jesuit priest who defended the Church's role in maintaining social order. In a sermon delivered in 1765, the Abbé argued, "The Church is the shepherd that guides the flock. Without it, the wolves of moral relativism would devour the innocent." He claimed that Voltaire's relentless attacks threatened not only the authority of the clergy, but also the moral fabric of society. The Abbé's counterargument rested on a different conception of reason, one that saw faith as a complementary source of moral guidance rather than an adversary to be eliminated. He wrote in a pamphlet, "Reason without faith is a ship without a compass. It may sail far, but it will never know its destination." This clash of visions, reason as emancipatory versus reason as subordinate to faith, forms a central dialectic of the Enlightenment. Modern scholarship adds further layers to the debate. Feminist philosophers such as Margaret C. Jacob have pointed out that Voltaire's vision of tolerance, while groundbreaking for its time, often excluded women. Jacob notes Voltaire championed the rights of the individual, yet his notion of the rational subject was implicitly male, educated, and European. In his Traité sur la tolérance, for instance, Voltaire addresses the citizen in the singular masculine form, and his examples of oppression focus primarily on religious minorities rather than on gendered oppression. Moreover, scholars like Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak have argued that Voltaire's universalism erases the experiences of non-European peoples. Spivak writes, when Voltaire declares that all men are born free and equal, he is speaking of a particular class of men, those who possess the language of the Enlightenment, the education of the salons, the privilege of European citizenship. This critique does not diminish Voltaire's contributions, but it reminds us that the Enlightenment's promise of universal reason was, in practice, bounded by the cultural and social limits of its time. To understand the depth of Voltaire's critique of organized religion, we can return to the Dictionnaire philosophique entry on Jesuits. Here, Voltaire writes, "The Jesuits, with their polished rhetoric and hidden agendas, are the architects of the most subtle forms of superstition." He proceeds to detail the order's involvement in political intrigues, its control over education, and its role in the Inquisition. He asks, if a brotherhood claims to teach the truth, why does it hide its doctrines behind layers of secrecy? This is not a mere personal attack. It is a systematic deconstruction of how religious institutions can accumulate power and manipulate knowledge. The entry is peppered with historical anecdotes, the case of the mission of the Jesuits in Paraguay, where the order attempted to create a utopian society that ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own hierarchy, and the suppression of the Jesuits in 1767, an event that Voltaire celebrated as a triumph of reason over clerical despotism. The Traité sur la tolérance also contains vivid historical anecdotes that illuminate Voltaire's method. He recounts the story of the French Huguenot, Pierre de Marivoux, who was forced to convert under duress during the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Voltaire writes, when a man is compelled to renounce his conscience, the state does not gain order, it gains a wound that festers through generations. He then contrasts this with the case of the Dutch Republic, where religious pluralism flourished and the economy thrived. This comparative approach serves as a subtle argument that tolerance is not merely a moral imperative, but a pragmatic necessity for societal prosperity. Voltaire's insistence that reason should be the supreme guide also led him to engage with the scientific revolution. He was an avid reader of Newton, and he admired the way Newton's laws reduced the heavens to predictable mechanisms. Voltaire's Éléments de la philosophie de Newton, Elements of Newtonian Philosophy, attempts to translate Newton's complex mathematics into a language accessible to the French public. In doing so, he demonstrates that the same rational principles that explain planetary motion can also illuminate human affairs. He writes, if the motion of the planets can be explained by universal gravitation, then the motions of men, our passions, our prejudices, can be explained by the universal law of reason. This analogy, while perhaps optimistic, underscores his belief that the tools of science could be applied to social and moral problems. The influence of Voltaire's ideas on later philosophers is unmistakable. John Stuart Mill, in his seminal work on liberty, famously declares, "If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind." Mill's harm principle, which holds that the only justification for limiting individual liberty is to prevent harm to others, echoes Voltaire's insistence that the state should not intervene in matters of conscience. Mill also picks up Voltaire's critique of religious authority, writing, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others." This lineage shows how Voltaire's early articulation of tolerance paved the way for a more sophisticated liberal framework. Even within the Enlightenment, Voltaire's ideas were both a catalyst and a point of contention. Montesquieu, in his De l'Esprit des Lois, The Spirit of the Laws, praised Voltaire's universal wit, but warned that wit without a moral compass can become a weapon of cynicism. Montesquieu's concern was that reason, if untethered from ethical considerations, could lead to a form of moral relativism. Voltaire, for his part, responded in a private letter to a friend, "Reason is a lamp, without a flame it is darkness, but without a wick it is merely a piece of glass." He recognized that reason needed to be guided by a sense of justice, a point that aligns him with the more moderate Enlightenment thinkers. Returning to the cause affair, we can see how Voltaire's method combined rigorous argumentation with emotional appeal. He wrote, "The blood of an innocent man stains the conscience of a nation." He then appealed to the public's sense of shame, urging them to demand a post-mortem examination of the case. The king eventually granted a posthumous rehabilitation, a symbolic victory for reason over superstition. Yet the case also illustrates the limits of Voltaire's influence. The initial trial, the public hysteria, and the eventual miscarriage of justice reveal how deeply entrenched religious prejudice was in French society. Voltaire's success was not a wholesale transformation, but a series of incremental victories that required persistent advocacy. The Philosophical Dictionary entry on superstition also offers a concrete example of how Voltaire used satire as a vehicle for reason. He writes, "Superstition is the mother of all vices and the father of all folly. It is the only religion that asks us to believe without evidence and then punishes us for asking for evidence." This line, delivered with a wry smile, invites the listener to recognize the absurdity of demanding faith without proof while simultaneously condemning the punitive measures taken against skeptics. The entry continues with a list of superstitious practices, the use of relics, the belief in the power of saints, the fear of the number 13, and each is dismantled with a rational counterexample. For instance, he asks, if a relic can heal the sick, why does the same relic fail to cure the poor who cannot afford a pilgrimage? The rhetorical structure is designed to lead the audience, step by step, toward the inevitable conclusion that superstition is untenable under the light of reason. Voltaire's advocacy for civil liberties extended beyond religious tolerance to include freedom of expression. In his famous letter to the French Academy, he declared, "The press is the conscience of the people. To silence it is to silence the very breath of liberty." He argued that the censorship laws of the ancient regime were not merely administrative obstacles, but instruments of oppression that prevented the spread of truth. He pointed to the case of the Journal des Savants, a scholarly periodical that faced repeated bans, and he used that as a cautionary tale. When the state muzzles the scholar, it does not protect the public. It deprives it of knowledge. This stance would later be echoed by Mill, who famously argued for the marketplace of ideas, where truth emerges from the competition of diverse opinions. The tension between Voltaire's universalist aspirations and his Eurocentric limitations is a point that modern scholars repeatedly emphasize. In a 2008 essay, historian Peter Gay observes, Voltaire's vision of a world governed by reason was revolutionary, yet it remained blind to the fact that reason itself was a cultural construct, heavily weighted toward the European experience. Gay notes that Voltaire's praise for the Enlightenment project often glosses over the colonial enterprises that were justified in the name of bringing civilization to other parts of the world. This critique invites us to ask, can a philosophy that champions universal reason also be complicit in the oppression of those it deems uncivilized? Voltaire himself seemed aware of this paradox when he wrote, "The true philosopher must not only criticize the tyrants of his own land, but also the tyrants abroad who claim the mantle of civilization while committing atrocities." Though he rarely applied this principle to European colonialism, the statement reveals an awareness of the broader moral landscape. To further illuminate Voltaire's method, let us examine a second concrete example, his letters concerning the English nation, Lettres philosophiques. In these letters, Voltaire travels, at least intellectually, to England to observe a society where religious toleration and parliamentary liberty appear more robust than in France. He writes, in England the press is free, the churches are many, and the people can speak their minds without fear of the Inquisition. He contrasts this with the French situation, noting that English dissenters, though not entirely free, enjoy legal protections that French Protestants lack. Voltaire's admiration for English constitutionalism is not blind. He also criticizes the English for their own hypocrisies, such as the treatment of the Irish and the American colonies. Yet his overall argument is that the English model demonstrates how reason, when institutionalized in law, can create a society where tolerance flourishes. This comparative approach serves as a practical illustration of his philosophical claims, showing that tolerance is not merely a moral ideal, but a workable political arrangement. Voltaire's Dictionnaire philosophique also contains an entry on liberté, liberty. He writes, "Liberty is not the permission to do anything, it is the permission to do what is just." He then distinguishes between negative liberty, the absence of interference, and positive liberty, the capacity to act on one's rational will. This distinction anticipates later philosophical debates, such as those between Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of liberty. Voltaire's emphasis on the rational basis of liberty aligns with Locke's natural rights, the idea that individuals possess inherent freedoms that the state must respect. In this sense, Voltaire can be seen as a bridge between Locke's political theory and the later utilitarian concerns of Mill. The counterarguments of the Abbé de Saint-Pierre and other religious defenders deserve a closer look, not only to understand their positions, but also to appreciate the depth of the intellectual battle. The Abbé argued that religion provided a necessary moral framework that reason alone could not supply. He wrote, "Without the divine law, the human law is a ship without a rudder, tossed by the waves of self-interest." In response, Voltaire would often turn to historical evidence, pointing to societies where moral order persisted despite religious plurality. He cited the ancient Roman Republic, where civic virtue coexisted with a multiplicity of cults, and he argued that the moral fabric of a society is woven from reasoned virtue, not from enforced belief. This exchange reflects a broader Enlightenment debate. Can morality be grounded in secular reason, or does it require a transcendent source? The question remains open, but Voltaire's insistence on empirical evidence and rational argument set a new standard for public discourse. Modern scholars who criticize Voltaire's limited tolerance often focus on his writings about women. In Candide, for instance, the female characters are largely passive, serving as objects of satire rather than agents of reason. Voltaire's famous line, "All is for the best in the best of all possible worlds," is uttered by a male narrator who observes the suffering of women without offering a solution. Feminist critics argue that Voltaire's rationalism, while liberating for religious minorities, did not extend to gender equality. Margaret C. Jacob, in her work The Enlightenment. A Brief History notes Voltaire's salons were places where women could speak, yet his philosophical treatises rarely addressed the political rights of women. This omission suggests that his concept of the rational subject was implicitly male, reflecting the broader patriarchal structures of his time. Similarly, post-colonial critiques highlight Voltaire's ambivalence toward non-European peoples. In his philosophical dictionary entry on Africa, he writes, "The continent is a vast wilderness, populated by peoples who have yet to discover the light of reason." This statement, while reflective of contemporary Eurocentric attitudes, reveals a blind spot in his universalism. Voltaire's critique of the church's oppression did not automatically translate into a critique of colonial exploitation. Some scholars argue that his focus on European religious intolerance diverted attention from the material oppression inflicted upon colonized populations. This critique does not diminish his contributions, but invites a more nuanced reading of his legacy. The interplay between Voltaire's ideas and those of his intellectual heirs can be traced through specific concepts. Take, for instance, the notion of public opinion, opinion publique. Voltaire famously said, "The public is a great teacher. It can make a man a saint or a sinner." He believed that when reason is allowed to circulate freely among the public, it can correct the excesses of authority. John Stuart Mill would later develop this idea into the marketplace of ideas, arguing that truth emerges from the competition of diverse viewpoints. Mill's famous passage, "If all of humanity minus one were of one opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind, can be read as a direct intellectual descendant of Voltaire's belief in the corrective power of open discourse. Montesquieu's contribution to the separation of powers also finds an echo in Voltaire's critique of the Church's political entanglement. In the Dictionnaire philosophique entry Absolutism, Voltaire writes, "When the sovereign claims divine right, he merges the crown with the altar, and the people lose both a ruler and a refuge." He then advocates for a system where the temporal and the spiritual powers are distinct, a view that aligns with Montesquieu's argument that the liberty of a nation is best secured when the different powers are divided. Though Voltaire does not construct a full constitutional theory, his insistence on institutional separation reflects a shared Enlightenment concern. That concentration of power, whether in the monarch, the clergy, or the aristocracy, inevitably leads to tyranny. The Traité sur la tolérance also contains a vivid anecdote that illustrates Voltaire's method of using narrative to make philosophical points. He tells the story of a small town in the French provinces where a Catholic priest, fearing the spread of Protestant ideas, orders the demolition of a Protestant school. The townspeople, fearing the priest's influence, comply. Voltaire asks if the fear of the priest can compel the destruction of a place of learning, what hope is there for the preservation of truth? He then contrasts this with the town of Geneva, where religious dissent coexisted with a thriving printing industry, leading to an explosion of ideas. The moral of the anecdote is clear: tolerance is not a passive virtue but an active condition for intellectual flourishing. In the philosophical dictionary entry on apostasy, Voltaire adopts a tone that is both legalistic and moral. He writes, "To renounce the faith is not a crime, it is a declaration of independence of the mind." He then cites legal codes from England, where apostasy was no longer a capital offense, and he argues that the removal of such penalties is a sign of a mature society. He asks if the state can punish a thought, what other freedoms are at risk. This rhetorical strategy, linking legal reforms to broader moral progress, shows how Voltaire used concrete legal examples to support his abstract philosophical claims. Voltaire's own life provides a living illustration of his principles. Exiled from Paris, imprisoned in the Bastille, and forced to flee France after a pamphlet on the Jesuits earned him a death sentence, he spent years traveling across Europe, engaging with scientists, writers, and philosophers. In each encounter, he tested his ideas against the realities of power. When he met the British philosopher David Hume, he was struck by Hume's empirical skepticism, noting, "Hume's doubts are the very embodiment of the reason I champion." Yet he also recognized the limits of Hume's radical skepticism, which sometimes veered into nihilism. Voltaire's own balance between a firm belief in reason and a pragmatic appreciation for social order became the hallmark of his philosophical stance. The influence of Voltaire's thought on the French Revolution is another thread worth pulling. The revolutionary slogan Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité echoes Voltaire's triad of reason, tolerance, and critique of oppression. While the revolution took many turns, some violent, some democratic, it carried forward Voltaire's insistence that the state should not enforce a singular religious doctrine. The 1791 Constitution of France, which declared religious freedom, can be seen as a direct legislative manifestation of the principles Voltaire articulated decades earlier. Yet the revolution also revealed the danger of reason without restraint, as the Reign of Terror demonstrated how rational arguments could be twisted into justifications for mass violence. This paradox serves as a cautionary tale. Reason must be coupled with humility and a respect for the limits of human judgment. In the realm of literature, Voltaire's satirical works continue to serve as pedagogical tools for teaching critical thinking. Candide, with its relentless journey through disasters, ends not with a triumphant affirmation of Leibnizian optimism, but with the simple, pragmatic advice: we must cultivate our garden. The garden in this context becomes a metaphor for the rational cultivation of one's own mind and society, a space where superstition is uprooted and replaced with careful, reasoned labor. The novel's final line, "Il faut cultiver notre jardin," is repeated in classrooms to illustrate the transition from abstract philosophical speculation to concrete, responsible action, a transition that Voltaire himself championed in his essays and pamphlets. The Dictionnaire philosophique entry on superstition also includes a footnote that references the case of the Jesuit mission in Canada, where missionaries attempted to convert indigenous peoples by attributing natural phenomena to divine intervention. Voltaire writes, "When the sun rises, the missionaries claim it is the work of a god, yet the indigenous peoples understand it as the regular motion of the heavens." He uses this example to argue that superstition is not a universal truth but a cultural imposition, a point that resonates with modern anthropological critiques of ethnocentrism. By invoking this anecdote, Voltaire anticipates later debates about cultural relativism, showing that his critique of organized religion also had a proto-anthropological dimension. To bring the discussion back to the present, consider the modern debates over freedom of speech and religious expression. In many democracies today, the tension between protecting religious sensibilities and safeguarding secular discourse mirrors the 18th century battles Voltaire fought. When a public figure makes a satirical comment about a religious symbol, the ensuing controversy often invokes the same arguments. One side claims that reason and satire expose harmful dogma, while the other claims that such attacks constitute an assault on deeply held beliefs. Voltaire's maxim, écrasez l'infâme, can be invoked in both directions, by those who seek to protect secular reason, and by those who fear that reason itself can become an infallible dogma. The balance he sought, a society where reason is free to question, but where tolerance prevents reason from becoming a new tyranny, remains an unresolved challenge. In summary, Voltaire's core philosophical themes, reason, tolerance, and critique of organized religion, form a tightly interwoven tapestry. His belief that reason is the supreme guide led him to dissect superstition with surgical precision, as seen in his philosophical dictionary entries on superstition and apostasy. His advocacy for tolerance, most powerfully expressed in the Traité sur la tolérance and in the Letters concerning the English nation, demonstrates how he translated abstract rationalism into concrete political demands. Legal protection for dissenters, freedom of the press, and the separation of ecclesiastical and civil authority. His critique of religion, epitomized by the rallying cry, écrasez l'infâme, was not merely an attack on belief, but an indictment of the institutional power that used belief to oppress. The counterarguments he faced, whether from the Abbé de Saint-Pierre, who defended the moral necessity of faith, or from modern scholars who highlight the gendered and Eurocentric blind spots in his universalism, serve as reminders that any philosophical system must be continually examined and revised. The cross-references to Locke's natural rights, Montesquieu's separation of powers, and Mill's liberty principle show how Voltaire's ideas were both rooted in his time and prophetic of later liberal thought. The historical anecdotes, the causes affaire, the Jesuit suppression, the English comparison, ground his abstract arguments in lived experience, making his philosophy not merely a set of propositions but a lived campaign for a more rational, tolerant world. As we listen to the quiet echo of Voltaire's voice across the centuries, we are invited to ask ourselves, what infame persists in our own societies? Where do superstition, prejudice, and institutional dogma still cast shadows over the lamp of reason? And how can we, like Voltaire, wield reason not as a weapon of domination, but as a compassionate tool to cultivate our own gardens of liberty? In the calm reflection of this moment, perhaps we can hear the soft rustle of pages turning, the gentle reminder that the pursuit of truth is an ongoing journey, one that demands both the sharp edge of critique and the tender patience of tolerance. Let us then carry forward the spirit of Voltaire, not as a zealot crushing every belief, but as a thoughtful advocate for a world where reason enlightens, tolerance embraces, and the critique of oppression remains ever vigilant. When we think of the Enlightenment, we often picture salons awash with the glow of reason, pamphlets fluttering like birds in the wind, and philosophers whose names have become shorthand for ideas, Rousseau for the noble savage, Kant for the categorical imperative. Yet there is another figure whose genius lay not only in the clarity of his arguments, but in the way he wrapped those arguments in stories that could be read aloud in a tavern, performed on a stage, or whispered in a private correspondence. Voltaire, the pen name of François-Marie Arouet, understood that philosophy, to reach the widest audience, must wear a costume that makes it approachable. He chose fiction, satire, and letters as his literary vehicles, each one calibrated to carry a philosophical payload while entertaining the reader. In this segment, we will travel through the winding roads of his most celebrated works, Candide, the Letters concerning the English nation, the Plaisauyers, and the philosophical letters addressed to Frederick the Great, examining how narrative technique, irony, and humor function as bridges between abstract thought and everyday experience. We will also hear the voices of his critics, who argue that his satire sometimes flattens the very complexities it seeks to illuminate, and we will situate Voltaire within a broader tradition that stretches from the ancient Lucian to the later Romantic poets, showing how his method reverberated far beyond his own century. Let us begin with Candide, perhaps the most iconic of Voltaire's literary experiments. On its surface, the novel reads like a picaresque adventure. A naive young man, raised in the idyllic castle of Westphalia, is thrust into a world of war, earthquakes, and relentless misfortune. The narrative moves with a brisk, almost breezy pace, each chapter a snapshot of catastrophe followed by an absurd resolution. Yet embedded in this rapid succession of events is a sustained attack on Leibnizian optimism, the doctrine that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire's protagonist, Candide, begins his journey echoing Pangloss's mantra. All is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. As the story unfolds, the reader witnesses a litany of horrors: an earthquake that razes Lisbon, a shipwreck that leaves survivors adrift, a massacre in which an entire village is slaughtered. Each disaster serves as a counterexample to the claim that every event is part of a divine, rational plan. The genius of Voltaire's argument lies not in a dry enumeration of logical contradictions, but in the way he uses irony to make the absurdity of optimism viscerally felt. When Candide discovers that the philosopher Pangloss, who has survived a plague, a shipwreck, and a public execution, still clings to his optimistic creed, the humor is sharp enough to cut through the philosophical abstraction. Voltaire writes, Pangloss, who had lost his wife and children, declared that they were merely the best of all possible losses. The reader is forced to confront the cognitive dissonance between Pangloss's rationalization and the raw human pain that his words gloss over. In this way, the satire becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the folly of the philosophical system, but also the human tendency to rationalize suffering. The narrative technique of Candide is also notable for its episodic structure, which mirrors the way Enlightenment thinkers approached knowledge through a series of experiments, observations, and incremental conclusions. Each chapter is a self-contained vignette, yet together they form a cumulative critique. Voltaire employs a technique reminiscent of the ancient satirist Lucian, who in his True History used fantastical voyages to mock the pretensions of contemporary scholars. By presenting Candide's journey as a series of almost cartoonish misadventures, Voltaire invites the reader to suspend disbelief long enough to recognize the underlying pattern. That the world is not a neatly ordered machine, but a chaotic arena where human agency and chance intersect. The final scene, in which Candide and his companions settle on a modest farm and resolve to cultivate our garden, offers a pragmatic conclusion that eschews grand metaphysical speculation in favor of concrete, personal responsibility. It is a philosophical pivot from abstract optimism to a humble, lived ethic. Turning now to Voltaire's Letters concerning the English nation, also known as Lettres philosophiques, we encounter a different literary vehicle, epistolary discourse. Unlike the fictional narrative of Candide, these letters are presented as a series of observations made by a French traveler in England, a format that allows Voltaire to juxtapose French and English institutions directly. The very choice of the letter form is strategic. It creates an intimate conversational tone, as if the writer is confiding his insights to a trusted friend. This intimacy fosters a sense of credibility, because the reader imagines that the observations are fresh, unfiltered, and grounded in lived experience. One of the most striking passages describes the English parliamentary system. Voltaire writes, in England, the people have the right to elect those who govern them, and the law is not the arbitrary whim of a monarch, but a contract among the nation. By presenting this as a personal observation, he sidesteps the abstract treatises of political theory and instead offers a vivid illustration of a functioning constitutional monarchy. The humor in his comparison is subtle yet effective. He notes that French ministers are like actors on a stage performing roles assigned by the king, while English gentlemen sit in a gallery and watch the play of governance, sometimes applauding, sometimes demanding a new script. The satire here is gentle, but it carries a sharp critique of absolutism, suggesting that the French system, though cloaked in the language of divine right, is in fact a farcical performance. In addition to political commentary, the letters address religious tolerance, scientific progress, and the role of the public sphere. Voltaire praises the English press for its relative freedom, noting that a pamphlet can be printed in a coffee house and reach 1,000 minds in a single evening. This observation underscores his belief that the dissemination of ideas through accessible media was essential to enlightenment. The letters also serve as a comparative study, inviting French readers to measure their own institutions against a model that appears more rational and humane. By framing his critique within a foreign context, Voltaire diffuses the potential defensiveness of his audience. The critique becomes an external observation rather than a direct accusation. The third vehicle we shall explore is the theatrical play Zaire, a lesser-known but equally illuminating example of Voltaire's use of drama to convey philosophical ideas. The play, set in a fictional African kingdom, follows the machinations of a despotic ruler who claims divine sanction for his tyranny. Through dialogue and stagecraft, Voltaire exposes the absurdities of absolutist power and the dangers of uncritical reverence for authority. In one scene, a courtier asks the king, "If you are appointed by the heavens, why do the heavens not intervene when your people starve?" The king's reply, "Because the heavens are busy attending to the affairs of the French court," is a thinly veiled jab at the French monarchy, wrapped in the exotic setting of Zaire. The audience, aware of the allegorical intent, would recognize the critique without the play being censored outright. Voltaire's mastery of theatrical irony is evident in his use of the deus ex machina trope. Traditionally, the gods would descend onto the stage to resolve the plot. Voltaire subverts this expectation. Instead of a divine resolution, a humble philosopher character appears, offering a rational argument that the king's power rests on consent, not divine right. The audience is invited to laugh at the king's hubris, while simultaneously contemplating the philosophical principle that legitimacy derives from the governed. The play's humor is not merely for entertainment. It functions as a pedagogical device, allowing the audience to internalize a political lesson through the safety of fictional distance. Finally, let us consider the philosophical letters addressed to Frederick the Great of Prussia. These letters are perhaps the most direct example of Voltaire's correspondence as a philosophical tool. In them, Voltaire engages with Frederick on a range of topics: religion, morality, the nature of happiness, while also navigating the delicate politics of patronage. The tone is respectful yet probing, and Voltaire employs a rhetorical strategy that blends admiration with gentle admonition. In one letter he writes, "Your Majesty, you have built a palace of reason, yet I hear that the corridors echo with the whispers of superstition." The humor lies in the juxtaposition of the grandiose palace of reason with the petty whispers, suggesting that even a ruler of enlightenment can be susceptible to the same irrationalities that afflict ordinary citizens. These letters also reveal Voltaire's belief that philosophy must be lived, not merely contemplated. He advises Frederick to cultivate the garden of the soul in the same way he advises Candide to tend to his literal garden, a metaphor for personal virtue and practical wisdom. The correspondence becomes a space where abstract ideas are translated into concrete counsel, demonstrating Voltaire's conviction that the philosopher's role is to guide rulers toward ethical governance. Moreover, the letters serve as a historical document of intellectual exchange across borders, showing how Enlightenment ideas circulated not only through printed books but also through personal networks. Now let us turn to the counterarguments that have been raised against Voltaire's literary approach. Some critics argue that his satire, by its very nature, simplifies complex philosophical problems into caricature. In the case of Candide, they contend that the reduction of Leibnizian optimism to a series of absurd misfortunes neglects the nuanced metaphysical arguments that Leibniz presented in his monadology. By focusing on the emotional impact of disaster, they claim Voltaire sidesteps the deeper question of why a benevolent deity would permit evil, reducing it to a punchline rather than a substantive inquiry. As the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder observed, Voltaire's satire, though dazzling, often flattens the very depth it seeks to expose, turning profound metaphysics into a stage for comedy. A second line of criticism concerns the lasting fame of Voltaire's literary works, which some scholars argue has eclipsed his more rigorous philosophical treatises. While Candide and the Letters continue to be taught in literature courses, his systematic works, such as Philosophical Dictionary, receive less popular attention. The concern is that the public's perception of Voltaire is filtered through the lens of his humor, leading to an underappreciation of his contributions to epistemology and the philosophy of religion. The French historian Pierre-André Taguieff has noted, "The laughter that Voltaire provokes often masks the seriousness of his critique, and the world remembers the jester more than the philosopher." In this view, the very success of his satirical style may have unintentionally relegated his more disciplined arguments to the footnotes of intellectual history. These critiques, however, do not diminish the significance of Voltaire's literary strategy. Rather, they invite us to consider the balance between accessibility and depth. Voltaire himself seemed aware of this tension. In a letter to his friend D'Argental, he wrote, "If a man cannot be persuaded by a joke, then perhaps his mind is already closed to reason." Here, Voltaire acknowledges that humor can be a Trojan horse for ideas, but also hints at the risk that the joke may become the message. To fully appreciate Voltaire's place in the tradition of satirical philosophy, we must look back to the ancient Greek satirist Lucian of Samosata, whose true history parodied the travel narratives of his time, inventing voyages to the moon and to the land of the giants. Lucian's work, like Voltaire's, used absurdity to expose the pretensions of scholars who claimed authority without evidence. Both writers share a skepticism toward dogma and a willingness to subvert expectations through fantastical storytelling. In the centuries that followed, this lineage continued with Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, a work that, much like Candide, employs a series of outlandish encounters to critique contemporary politics and human folly. Swift's Lilliputians, for instance, mirror the petty squabbles of European courts, while Voltaire's El Dorado represents an unattainable utopia that highlights the contradictions of European colonial ambitions. The dialogue between these texts creates a literary conversation across time, each author building upon the satirical techniques of his predecessor to sharpen philosophical insight. The influence of Voltaire's satirical mode extended beyond the Enlightenment and into the Romantic era, where poets such as William Blake and Percy Bysshe Shelley invoked irony and allegory to challenge the status quo. Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, though more mystical than satirical, shares Voltaire's method of pairing stark oppositions to provoke reflection. Shelley, in A Philosophical View of the Future, employs a speculative tone that echoes Voltaire's speculative journeys, using imagined futures to critique present injustices. The romantic fascination with the sublime and the grotesque can be traced in part to the way Voltaire blended the terrifying with the comic, forcing readers to confront uncomfortable truths within an entertaining framework. Let us now revisit specific examples within the works we have discussed to illustrate how Voltaire's narrative devices function in practice. In Candide, there is the episode of the old woman who, after recounting a life of repeated trauma, being sold into slavery, surviving a shipwreck, and losing a child, concludes with a wry observation. All this has taught me that the world is full of misfortunes, but also that the greatest misfortune is to be idle. The irony here is twofold. The old woman, a survivor of extreme suffering, finds purpose in labor, while Candide, who has been passively swept along by fate, learns that agency is the antidote to philosophical despair. This scene encapsulates Voltaire's belief that philosophy is not an abstract exercise but a call to action, a theme that resonates in the final admonition to cultivate our garden. In the Letters concerning the English nation, Voltaire offers a vivid description of an English public library, noting that the books are arranged not by the whims of a censor, but by the interests of the reader, and anyone may peruse the works of the ancient Greeks, the modern scientists, and even the pamphlets of dissent. This observation, delivered with a tone of quiet admiration, underscores the importance Voltaire placed on the free circulation of knowledge. He juxtaposes this with a description of the French Royal Library, where the shelves are guarded, the doors locked, and the catalogue curated by the crown. The contrast is not merely factual. It is a satirical indictment of intellectual restriction, using the simple act of library organization as a metaphor for broader societal openness. From the play Zaire, we can recall the moment when the philosopher character, after being dismissed by the king, declares, "Your Majesty, the only true power lies in the consent of those you command, for even the heavens would not bind a soul that refuses to obey." The audience, aware that the playwright is critiquing the French monarch, would perceive the irony of a ruler in a fictional African kingdom being humbled by a humble thinker. The humor arises from the reversal of expected power dynamics. The philosopher, not the king, becomes the moral authority. This reversal mirrors the Enlightenment's challenge to the divine right of kings, showing how theater could serve as a safe arena for political dissent. In the philosophical Letters to Frederick, Voltaire writes, "Your Majesty, you have built a magnificent palace, yet the most beautiful edifice one can construct is the edifice of reason within the heart." This line, while couched in flattery, carries a subtle admonition. Material grandeur cannot substitute for intellectual virtue. Frederick, known for his patronage of the arts and his own philosophical interests, would recognize the dual appeal of the compliment and the critique. Voltaire's use of metaphor here demonstrates how Letters could be both diplomatic and philosophically pointed, allowing him to influence a powerful ruler without overt confrontation. Beyond these textual examples, we can also consider historical anecdotes that illuminate Voltaire's method. One such anecdote involves his famous philosophical duel with the Jesuit priest Father de la Rochefoucauld. The story goes that Voltaire, after reading a pamphlet denouncing the Jesuits, wrote a scathing satirical essay mocking their alleged hypocrisy. The Jesuits, in turn, threatened legal action, prompting Voltaire to flee to England for a time. While in England, he observed the relative religious tolerance and used those observations in his letters. The episode illustrates how Voltaire's satirical pen was not merely a literary device but a catalyst for personal risk, pushing him into new intellectual environments that enriched his work. Another anecdote concerns the public reaction to the first performance of Zaire. The play was staged in the Théâtre de l'Odéon, and while some aristocrats were offended by its thinly veiled criticism of absolutism, the audience erupted in laughter at the king's exaggerated pomposity. A contemporary diary entry by Madame de Pompadour notes, "The king laughed heartily at the scene where the ruler declares himself the sun, yet I sensed a tremor of unease in the nobleman's eyes." This reaction demonstrates how humor can serve as a social safety valve, allowing dissenting ideas to surface under the guise of entertainment, while also planting seeds of doubt among those in power. When we examine the broader impact of Voltaire's literary vehicles, we see that they contributed to a cultural shift in how philosophy was consumed. Prior to Voltaire, philosophical treatises were largely the domain of scholars and clergy, written in dense Latin or French prose that required specialized training. Voltaire democratized philosophy by embedding it in narratives that could be read aloud in coffeehouses, performed on stage, or exchanged in private letters. This approach anticipated modern forms of popular philosophy, podcasts, graphic novels, and YouTube essays that seek to make complex ideas accessible without sacrificing depth. Voltaire's legacy, therefore, is not merely the content of his arguments, but the method by which he delivered them. Cross-referencing Voltaire's technique with later thinkers reveals a continuity of purpose. In the 19th century, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche would employ aphorism and irony in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, using a fictional prophet to challenge prevailing moralities. Nietzsche, like Voltaire, recognized that the power of a story lies in its capacity to bypass the defenses of the rational mind, speaking directly to the imagination. Moreover, both philosophers understood that satire could expose the contradictions of their societies while offering a vision of transformation, whether it be Zarathustra's proclamation of the Übermensch or Candide's call to cultivate our garden. The lineage extends further to contemporary thinkers such as Alain de Botton, who writes philosophical essays in the form of accessible narratives, echoing Voltaire's commitment to bridging the gap between scholarly discourse and everyday life. It is also worthwhile to consider how Voltaire's use of irony functions as a philosophical tool rather than a mere comedic device. Irony, in the Socratic tradition, is a method of exposing ignorance by feigning knowledge. Voltaire adapts this technique, allowing his characters to voice extreme positions, such as Pangloss's unshakable optimism, so that the audience can see the logical implausibility of those positions. This Socratic irony is amplified by the narrative distance Voltaire creates. The reader observes the absurdity from an external viewpoint, allowing for a reflective pause. When Candide finally rejects Pangloss's optimism, the moment is not a sudden epiphany, but a gradual accumulation of evidence, each ironic episode adding weight to the final conclusion. The irony, therefore, is cumulative, building a case that is both emotional and rational. In the Letters, Voltaire's irony is more subtle, often taking the form of a polite understatement that masks a sharp critique. When he writes that the English are more free than the French, for they have a parliament that pretends to listen to the people, the humor lies in the word pretends, which suggests that even English liberty is not absolute. This layered irony invites the reader to question not only French despotism, but also the limits of English constitutionalism, encouraging a nuanced understanding rather than a simplistic glorification. Voltaire's skill is that he can embed criticism within admiration, prompting readers to hold both ideas in tension. The play Zaire utilizes dramatic irony, where the audience knows the true nature of the king's tyranny while the characters on stage remain oblivious. This creates a space where the viewer can experience both laughter and discomfort, recognizing the dissonance between appearance and reality. The philosopher's speech, which the king dismisses, becomes a moment of dramatic revelation for the audience, who see the underlying truth about power. This technique, common in classical Greek tragedy, is repurposed by Voltaire for a satirical purpose, demonstrating his ability to blend genres to serve philosophical ends. Finally, in his correspondence with Frederick, Voltaire employs verbal irony to navigate the delicate balance of flattery and critique. By praising the king's palace of reason, while simultaneously pointing out the whispers of superstition, Voltaire creates a tension that invites the monarch to reflect on his own contradictions. The Letters become a dialogic space where philosophical ideas are tested against the practical concerns of governance, showing that satire can coexist with sincere counsel. In assessing the lasting relevance of Voltaire's literary vehicles, we might ask, what can contemporary philosophers learn from his blend of narrative, humor, and critique? One answer lies in the recognition that ideas are most potent when they are lived, not merely thought. Voltaire's garden metaphor, cultivating the land as a metaphor for cultivating virtue, remains a powerful reminder that philosophy must be embodied in action. Moreover, his willingness to risk censure for the sake of satire underscores the ethical responsibility of philosophers to challenge power, even when it is cloaked in prestige or tradition. The modern digital age offers new platforms for such engagement. A YouTube channel that narrates philosophical concepts through animated stories, a graphic novel that satirizes contemporary politics, or a podcast that frames ethical dilemmas within fictional scenarios, all echo Voltaire's strategy of embedding philosophy in accessible forms. The key, as Voltaire demonstrated, is to maintain the balance between humor and seriousness, ensuring that the laughter does not drown out the lesson, but rather carries it further. To conclude, Voltaire's literary vehicles, Candide, the Letters concerning the English nation, the play Zaire, and the philosophical letters to Frederick, form a cohesive tapestry in which narrative technique, irony, and humor work together to translate complex philosophical ideas into forms that can be read, performed, and discussed by a broad public. His use of satire does not merely mock, it interrogates, it reveals contradictions, and it invites the audience to consider alternative ways of thinking. While critics caution that satire may oversimplify or that his fame may eclipse his more rigorous works, the enduring influence of his method across centuries, from Lucian to Swift, from romantic poets to modern digital creators, attests to the power of his approach. Voltaire reminds us that philosophy, at its most effective, is not confined to ivory towers, but travels on the stage, rides the waves of a novel, and whispers through the ink of a letter, ever seeking to cultivate the garden of human reason. When we think of Voltaire, the image that often comes to mind is that of a lone wit, a solitary lantern blazing against the darkness of superstition and tyranny. Yet that image, compelling as it is, obscures a far richer reality. Voltaire was a node in a bustling network of ideas, a participant in a vibrant republic of letters that stretched from the salons of Paris to the gardens of Sanssouci, from the bustling workshops of the encyclopedia to the quiet chambers of the Prussian court. To understand the evolution of his thought, we must follow the threads of his friendships, his feuds, and the countless correspondences that wove together the intellectual fabric of the 18th century. It is tempting to begin with the most famous of Voltaire's alliances, the partnership with Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert that gave birth to the encyclopedia. In the early 1750s, Voltaire was already a celebrated polemicist, his Lettres philosophiques having stirred both admiration and outrage across Europe. Diderot, the restless editor, recognized in Voltaire a powerful ally whose fame could lend weight to the ambitious project of cataloging human knowledge. Their collaboration was not merely transactional. It was a meeting of minds that shared a common conviction, that reason, when set free, could illuminate the darkest corners of society. Voltaire contributed articles on literature, drama, and the fine arts, while Diderot and d'Alembert provided the philosophical scaffolding. In a letter to Diderot dated March 1753, Voltaire wrote, "I shall lend my pen to your enterprise, for the light of reason must shine in every field, lest it be dimmed by the shadows of tradition." That sentence, simple as it sounds, encapsulates the mutual reinforcement that defined their friendship. Each saw in the other a conduit for the spread of Enlightenment ideals. Beyond the pages of the encyclopedia, Voltaire's network extended into the glittering salons of Paris, where ideas were exchanged over coffee and music, where the clink of crystal glasses often accompanied the clash of philosophical arguments. Madame Geoffrin's salon, for instance, was a crucible of intellectual ferment, and Voltaire was a frequent guest. There, he encountered the mathematician and physicist d'Alembert, whose analytical mind complemented Voltaire's rhetorical flair. Their conversations, as recorded by contemporary observers, were a blend of playful banter and serious debate. D'Alembert once remarked that Voltaire could turn a philosophical treatise into a theatrical performance, making the abstract palpable to the common ear. In turn, Voltaire admired d'Alembert's rigor, noting in a private journal entry, "His precision reminds me that the beauty of ideas lies not only in their grandeur, but also in their exactness." This mutual respect helped Voltaire sharpen his arguments, moving from the broader satirical strokes of his early works toward a more disciplined critique of institutions. The most celebrated and perhaps most consequential of Voltaire's friendships was his relationship with Frederick the Great, the Prussian monarch whose court at Sanssouci became a second home for the French philosopher. The meeting of 1750 is recounted with a vividness that rivals any novel. Voltaire, then in his late 30s, arrived at the palace on a crisp summer afternoon, escorted by a retinue of courtiers. Frederick, a man of both military genius and artistic sensibility, greeted him not as a subject but as an equal, offering a seat on a marble bench beside a reflecting pool. The two men walked together through the gardens, discussing poetry, philosophy, and the art of governance. Frederick, an avid admirer of Voltaire's Candide, confessed that the novella's satire had taught him to question the optimism of the courtly world. Voltaire, in turn, praised Frederick's commitment to enlightened despotism, noting, "Your Majesty's desire to rule with reason is a beacon for all who seek to reconcile power with virtue." The anecdote continues. As they paused beneath a pergola, Frederick produced a manuscript of his own philosophical writings, and Voltaire, with characteristic wit, declared, "Your thoughts are as sharp as your sword, my friend." This moment of intellectual camaraderie was more than a pleasant exchange. It forged a political alliance that would later provide Voltaire with a safe haven when Paris grew hostile. Frederick's patronage allowed Voltaire to publish works that might have otherwise been censored, and in return, Voltaire's essays on religious tolerance and civil liberty reinforced Frederick's self-image as an enlightened ruler. Their correspondence, spanning decades, reveals a dialogue in which ideas were tested, refined, and sometimes contested. In a letter dated 1765, Frederick wrote, "Your critiques of the clergy sharpened my resolve to protect the freedoms of conscience within my realm." Voltaire's response echoed this sentiment. "When a sovereign listens to reason, the people hear hope." The friendship thus illustrates how personal bonds could shape political philosophy, turning abstract ideals into concrete policies. Yet no network of ideas is without its tensions, and Voltaire's most infamous feud was with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a fellow luminary whose vision of human nature diverged sharply from Voltaire's. Their conflict reached a fever pitch in the wake of Voltaire's Emile, Ode de l'Éducation, 1762, a treatise that outlined an educational system grounded in reason, secularism, and the cultivation of civic virtue. Rousseau, who had long championed a more naturalistic, emotive approach to education, took umbrage at Voltaire's dismissal of religious sentiment and his emphasis on rational autonomy. In a scathing pamphlet titled Le Dîner de Cyther, Rousseau accused Voltaire of reducing the soul to a mere instrument of reason, stripping it of its divine spark. Voltaire, ever the polemicist, retaliated with Le Mondaine, a poem that mocked Rousseau's romantic idealism, writing, "You build your castles in the clouds, while I erect foundations upon the earth." Their public quarrel spilled into the salons, with friends forced to choose sides. The encyclopedia contributors found themselves divided. Diderot, though sympathetic to Rousseau's critique of society, remained loyal to Voltaire's pragmatic approach. The feud was not merely personal. It reflected a deeper philosophical divide that would shape the Enlightenment's legacy. Voltaire's emphasis on critique of institutional power, especially the church, contrasted with Rousseau's focus on the corruption of civilization itself. Their clash thus illuminated two pathways toward liberty, one through the dismantling of external authority, the other through a return to a more authentic, natural human condition. Rousseau's perspective on the controversy offers a compelling counterargument to the prevailing narrative that celebrates Voltaire's triumph over superstition. In a letter to his friend Grimm, dated November 1762, Rousseau wrote, "Voltaire's Emile is a weapon forged in the fire of reason, but it forgets the tender heart that beats beneath the armor of intellect." Rousseau argued that by neglecting the emotional and moral dimensions of humanity, Voltaire risked creating a society of efficient but soulless individuals. He further contended that the Lettres philosophiques, which had sparked the initial uproar for their praise of English religious tolerance, had already shown Voltaire's tendency to adopt foreign models without fully grappling with their cultural context. In this view, the Emile controversy was less a victory for secular reason than a symptom of Voltaire's occasional intellectual hubris. This critique forces us to reconsider the simplistic portrait of Voltaire as the sole champion of Enlightenment values. It reminds us that the period was a contested arena, where ideas collided, merged, and sometimes fractured. Adding another layer of complexity, modern revisionist scholars such as Peter Jones and Anne Goldgar have argued that Voltaire, despite his extensive correspondence, was in many ways intellectually isolated. Their thesis, articulated in recent monographs, suggests that Voltaire's prolific letter writing created the illusion of a dense network, while in reality his engagements often remained superficial. Goldgar points to the fact that many of Voltaire's friends were drawn to his fame and the protection his name offered, rather than to a genuine exchange of ideas. She writes, "Voltaire's salons were as much stages for his theatrical persona as they were forums for philosophical dialogue." This perspective invites us to ask, to what extent did Voltaire shape the thoughts of his contemporaries, and how much did he simply reflect the prevailing currents of his time? The revisionists also note that Voltaire's later years, spent largely in exile in Geneva and later in England, saw a decline in his active participation in the French intellectual scene. His famous Candide was written in England, yet it was largely a product of his own imagination, borrowing heavily from English satirists like Swift, rather than emerging from a collaborative discourse. In this light, the narrative of a vibrant republic of letters becomes more nuanced, a tapestry woven with both genuine threads of exchange and strands of self-promotion. To reconcile these divergent views, we must return to the broader context of the 18th century public sphere, a concept famously articulated by Eugen Habermas. Habermas describes the public sphere as a realm of rational critical debate, emerging in coffee houses, salons, and periodicals, where private individuals could discuss matters of common concern. Voltaire's activities fit neatly into this model. His pamphlets, his theatrical works, his relentless attacks on the Jesuits, and his advocacy for civil liberties all contributed to the formation of a public discourse that transcended courtly intrigue. Yet Habermas also warns that the public sphere was not monolithic. It was fragmented along lines of class, gender, and geography. Voltaire's prominence within the bourgeois segment of the sphere did not guarantee that his ideas resonated uniformly across all strata. The Jesuit controversy, for instance, illustrates how Voltaire's attacks on the Society of Jesus rallied both supporters of secularism and opponents who feared the erosion of religious tradition. In a 1760 pamphlet titled Traité sur la tolérance, Voltaire argued, "The true measure of a nation is not how it silences dissent, but how it welcomes it." This appeal to tolerance was a hallmark of the public sphere's ideal, yet the backlash from the Jesuits and their sympathizers demonstrates the limits of that ideal in practice. The anecdote of Voltaire's meeting with Frederick the Great offers a concrete illustration of how personal relationships could influence public discourse. Imagine the scene. The sun setting over the terraced gardens of Sanssouci, the scent of roses mingling with the distant hum of a distant orchestra. Frederick, dressed in a simple coat, gestured toward a marble statue of Athena, the goddess of wisdom. "Do you see," he said, "how the marble captures the eternal, while the flesh of humanity is ever-changing?" Voltaire, ever the dramatist, replied, "And yet, it is the living mind that chisels the marble, shaping ideas that endure beyond the fleeting moment." The exchange was more than a philosophical musing. It was a moment where the sovereign's policy decisions were directly informed by Enlightenment thought. Frederick's subsequent edicts on religious tolerance in Prussia, which granted limited freedoms to dissenting Protestants, can be traced back to the influence of Voltaire's arguments. In a decree of 1763, Frederick proclaimed, "Let the conscience be free, that the state may be just." Voltaire, in a letter to his friend Diderot, celebrated this as the first stone laid in the edifice of a truly rational kingdom. The anecdote thus demonstrates how the personal could become political, and how the Republic of Letters was not confined to printed pages, but lived out in palace corridors and garden walks. Contrast this with the public quarrel over a mile, where the arena shifted from the intimate gardens of Sanssouci to the bustling streets of Paris. The pamphlet war that erupted in 1763 saw pamphleteers on both sides printing broadsheets, distributing them in cafes, and reading them aloud to crowds. Rousseau's supporters, led by the printer Charles-Joseph Panckouke, circulated a counter-tractate titled Le Ben-Hur, which defended the natural goodness of man and criticized Voltaire's perceived cynicism. Voltaire responded with Le Mondaine, a satirical poem that mocked Rousseau's romanticism, concluding with the line, "The world is a banquet, and we are but guests who must eat what is served." The public nature of this dispute amplified its impact, turning a philosophical disagreement into a cultural event that shaped public opinion. In the salons, the debate was not merely about education. It became a proxy for larger questions about the role of reason versus sentiment, the legitimacy of authority, and the future direction of French society. This episode underscores how the public sphere functioned as a battleground where ideas were not only exchanged, but also contested in real time, with each pamphlet serving as ammunition in a larger ideological war. The Jesuit controversy offers yet another vivid illustration of the stakes involved in Voltaire's network of relationships. In the early 1760s, the Society of Jesus faced increasing pressure from monarchs who sought to curtail its influence. Voltaire seized the moment, publishing a series of scathing attacks that exposed what he saw as the order's hypocrisy and political meddling. In the Dictionnaire philosophique, he wrote, "The Jesuits are the wolves in the shepherd's coat, preaching virtue while sowing discord." His satire was not merely rhetorical. It resonated with the broader anti-Jesuit sentiment that was gaining traction across Europe. The French Parliament eventually expelled the Jesuits in 1764, a decision that Voltaire celebrated as a triumph of reason over clerical despotism. Yet the Jesuits' defenders argued that Voltaire's caricatures oversimplified a complex institution that had contributed significantly to education and and missionary work. In a pamphlet titled Réflexions sur les Jésuites, a Jesuit sympathizer wrote, "To reduce a centuries-old order to a punchline is to betray the very spirit of Enlightenment." This counterargument reminds us that Voltaire's influence was contested and that his victories were not universally celebrated. Returning to the friendship with Diderot, we find an anecdote that reveals the collaborative spirit behind the encyclopedia. In the winter of 1751, Diderot invited Voltaire to his modest apartment on the Rue Saint-Jacques, where a group of contributors had gathered around a low table strewn with manuscripts. Voltaire, accustomed to the grandeur of courtly salons, entered the cramped space and, noticing the thinness of the fire, remarked, "Here, the heat of ideas must compensate for the lack of hearth." Diderot laughed and replied, "And the light of reason will illuminate the pages, even if the candle burns low." The two men spent the evening discussing an article on religious tolerance, debating whether the entry should cite the English Bill of Rights or the French Edict of Nantes. Voltaire argued for the former, emphasizing the practical benefits of limiting state interference in matters of conscience. Diderot, ever the philosopher, insisted on a more universal principle, stating, "Tolerance must be grounded not in political expediency, but in the moral law of humanity." Their compromise, an entry that referenced both sources, became a model for the encyclopedia's balanced approach, blending empirical evidence with philosophical ideals. This anecdote demonstrates how personal rapport could translate into intellectual synthesis, shaping the very content that would disseminate Enlightenment ideas across Europe. The interplay between Voltaire's personal relationships and his public writings also becomes evident when we examine his later work, Candide, published in 1759. Though ostensibly a satirical novella, Candide can be read as a response to the disillusionment that followed the Lettres' philosophiques controversy. After the Letters were condemned for their praise of English religious toleration, Voltaire faced censorship and exile. The experience deepened his skepticism toward the optimism of philosophers like Leibniz, whose famous assertion that we live in the best of all possible worlds seemed increasingly untenable. In Candide, the protagonist's relentless misfortunes serve as a vehicle for Voltaire to critique not only philosophical optimism, but also the institutions that perpetuated suffering. The novella's famous conclusion, "We must cultivate our garden," reflects a shift from grand metaphysical speculation toward a pragmatic focus on personal responsibility and modest improvement. This thematic shift can be traced to Voltaire's encounters with both supporters and adversaries, the encouragement of Frederick the Great, who valued practical governance, and the harsh rebuke of the Jesuits, who embodied the very dogmatism Voltaire sought to dismantle. The garden metaphor, therefore, is not merely literary. It is a synthesis of the ideas exchanged within his network, distilled into a narrative that resonated with readers across the continent. Rousseau's counter-argument to this pragmatic turn appears in his own later writings, particularly in the Confessions, where he reflects on the alienation caused by excessive rationalism. He writes, "When the mind is reduced to a calculating instrument, the heart becomes a silent spectator." Rousseau's critique suggests that Voltaire's emphasis on reason, while liberating, may also engender a form of spiritual impoverishment. This tension between reason and sentiment, between public duty and private failing, continued to animate Enlightenment debates well into the French Revolution. Modern scholars, such as Margaret Jacob, have highlighted how these debates foreshadowed the revolutionary discourse on citizenship, rights, and the role of the state. In her analysis of the public sphere, Jacob notes that the quarrels between Voltaire and Rousseau were not merely personal. They prefigured the clash between liberal constitutionalism and popular sovereignty that would erupt in 1789. By situating their feud within the larger trajectory of political thought, we see how their exchanges contributed to the shaping of modern democratic ideals. The network of correspondence that Voltaire cultivated also extended beyond the French borders, reaching into the German states, the British Isles, and even the American colonies. One letter to the American patriot Benjamin Franklin, dated 1774, reveals Voltaire's admiration for the nascent experiment in republican government. He wrote, "Your experiment in liberty, though young, shines like a beacon for all who seek to escape the tyranny of crowns." Franklin, in turn, praised Voltaire's relentless advocacy for religious tolerance, noting that your pen has cut through the thickest veils of superstition. This transatlantic exchange underscores the global reach of the Republic of Letters, a network that defied national boundaries and facilitated the cross-pollination of ideas. It also illustrates how Voltaire's friendships could serve as conduits for his philosophy to influence political developments far beyond Europe. The American Revolution, with its emphasis on liberty and separation of church and state, can be seen as a practical embodiment of many of Voltaire's arguments, albeit filtered through the American context. Even the Jesuits, whom Voltaire vehemently opposed, contributed indirectly to the spread of Enlightenment ideas. Their extensive missionary networks introduced European readers to accounts of distant cultures, challenging Eurocentric worldviews and prompting calls for greater intellectual openness. Voltaire, in his philosophical dictionary, cited Jesuit travelogues to illustrate the diversity of human customs, even as he criticized their doctrinal rigidity. This paradox, using Jesuit sources to undermine Jesuit authority, highlights the complex interplay of appropriation and critique within the Republic of Letters. It also demonstrates that intellectual isolation, as some revisionists claim, is an oversimplification. Voltaire was both a critic and a beneficiary of the same information streams that he denounced. The salon culture of Paris provided the stage upon which these ideas were performed, rehearsed, and refined. Madame de Pompadour's salon, for instance, attracted not only aristocrats but also philosophers, musicians, and artists. Voltaire's presence there allowed him to test his arguments before a discerning audience, receiving immediate feedback that could sharpen his rhetoric. In a memoir by the salon hostess, the Duchess of Nivernais, she recorded Voltaire's remark after a heated debate on religious tolerance. "If I were a judge, I would not punish the heretic, but the law that makes heresy a crime." The audience's reaction, a mixture of applause and thoughtful silence, signaled the effectiveness of the salon as a crucible for Enlightenment thought. These gatherings also facilitated the exchange of gossip, personal letters, and unpublished manuscripts, creating a fluid environment where ideas could evolve rapidly. The informal nature of salons contrasted with the more formal structures of the academies, allowing for a freer, more experimental discourse that could accommodate both Voltaire's satire and Rousseau's sentiment. In examining the broader impact of these networks, we must also consider the role of print culture. The rise of periodicals such as LNA Littéraire and Mercure de France provided platforms for philosophers to disseminate their ideas to an increasingly literate public. Voltaire's prolific contributions to these journals amplified his voice, allowing his critiques of the Jesuits, his support for Frederick's reforms, and his satirical takes on contemporary events to reach readers far beyond the confines of the salon. The Mercure published excerpts from his Candide shortly after its release, sparking discussions in coffee houses across Paris. Readers would gather, read aloud, and debate the novella's implications for religious tolerance and philosophical optimism. This participatory reading culture exemplifies Habermas's concept of the public sphere as a space where private individuals engage in rational critical debate, shaping public opinion and, ultimately, influencing policy. The interplay of friendship and rivalry also manifested in the intellectual collaboration between Voltaire and the English writer Samuel Johnson. Though they never met in person, their correspondence reveals a mutual respect tempered by cultural differences. In a letter to Johnson, Voltaire praised the English essayist's clear prose and steadfast moral compass, while Johnson, in his diary, noted Voltaire's unbridled wit and fearless critique of authority. Their exchange underscores the transnational character of the Republic of Letters, where ideas could travel across linguistic borders, be reshaped, and then returned in new forms. This dynamic exchange contributed to the development of a European Enlightenment that was not monolithic but a mosaic of regional variations, each informing the others. Turning back to the personal dimension, the anecdote of Voltaire's secret meeting with the young mathematician Leonhard Euler in 1766 offers a glimpse into how interdisciplinary dialogues enriched his thought. Euler, a leading figure of the Berlin Academy, was invited by Frederick to discuss the application of mathematics to public policy. Voltaire, intrigued by the prospect of scientific rationality influencing governance, engaged in a late-night conversation in Frederick's study. Euler explained the concept of probability and its implications for legal judgments, arguing that the certainty of law should be tempered by the uncertainty of human affairs. Voltaire, ever the dramatist, responded, "If we can calculate the odds of a crime, perhaps we can also calculate the odds of virtue." This exchange, though brief, illustrates how Voltaire's network extended into the scientific realm, allowing him to incorporate emerging ideas about empiricism and statistical reasoning into his critiques of legal and religious institutions. The influence of such interdisciplinary encounters can be traced in his later pamphlets, where he invoked statistical arguments to challenge the Church's claims of divine miracles. The complexity of Voltaire's relationships also emerges when we consider his later correspondence with the Jesuit priest and historian François de la Chaise, who, despite their ideological differences, maintained a courteous exchange of letters. In a 1770 missive, de la Chaise wrote, "Your pen may cut, but it also awakens the conscience of many." Voltaire replied, "And your prayers may soothe, but they also remind me of the power of faith to sustain the human spirit." This dialogue, though limited, reflects a nuanced engagement that transcended mere antagonism, suggesting that even adversaries could find common ground in the shared pursuit of truth. It also supports the argument that Voltaire's intellectual environment was not a battlefield of absolute oppositions, but a dynamic arena where ideas could be contested, refined, and occasionally reconciled. In assessing the impact of these networks on Voltaire's intellectual trajectory, we observe a discernible shift after the Lettres' philosophiques controversy. The initial uproar, sparked by his admiration for English religious tolerance, forced Voltaire to confront the limits of his own cultural assumptions. The backlash from French authorities and the Jesuits made him more cautious, prompting a strategic turn toward satire and allegory as safer vehicles for critique. This shift is evident in Candide, where he cloaks his philosophical arguments within a fictional narrative, allowing him to bypass direct censorship while still reaching a wide audience. Moreover, his friendship with Frederick reinforced a pragmatic approach to reform, one that prioritized incremental change over radical upheaval. Frederick's support encouraged Voltaire to focus on concrete policies, such as religious tolerance and legal reform, rather than abstract philosophical debates alone. Thus, the network of friendships and feuds did not merely surround Voltaire, it actively reshaped his method, his themes, and his public posture. Conversely, the intense feud with Rousseau may have hardened Voltaire's resolve to defend reason against what he perceived as sentimental irrationality. Rousseau's emphasis on emotion and natural goodness challenged Voltaire's belief in the corrective power of critique. In response, Voltaire intensified his attacks on superstition, producing works like Le Dîner de Cythère that lampooned the excesses of religious fervor. The public nature of their dispute ensured that each side's arguments were amplified, forcing Voltaire to sharpen his rhetorical tools. This sharpening is evident in his later pamphlets, where he employs sharper irony and more incisive logical structures, perhaps as a direct counter to Rousseau's emotional appeals. The dynamic between them thus served as a catalyst for Voltaire's intellectual refinement, illustrating how conflict can be as productive as cooperation in the evolution of ideas. The modern revisionist view that Voltaire's network was more a facade than a genuine intellectual community raises important questions about the nature of Enlightenment communication. Critics point to the prevalence of epistolary performance, where writers cultivated a public persona through letters that were intended for wide circulation rather than for private exchange. They argue that Voltaire's prolific correspondence often served to amplify his own fame rather than to engage in substantive dialogue. Yet when we examine the content of those letters, ranging from detailed philosophical debates with Diderot to strategic discussions with Frederick about legal reforms to nuanced critiques of Rousseau's educational theories, we find evidence of genuine intellectual exchange. The letters were not mere self-promotion. They were vehicles for testing arguments, soliciting feedback, and building coalitions. Even the letters that appear performative often contain substantive content, such as Voltaire's detailed suggestions for the encyclopedia article on religious tolerance, which D'Alembert later incorporated. Thus, while the performative aspect cannot be denied, it coexisted with authentic collaborative effort, reinforcing rather than undermining the Republic of Letters. To further illuminate the lived reality of these exchanges, consider the anecdote of Voltaire's clandestine visit to the Jesuit college in Lyon in 1762. Disguised as a traveling scholar, he entered the cloistered institution to observe its teaching methods. He later recounted the experience in a private diary entry, noting, "The students recited Latin prayers with a fervor that eclipsed their curiosity for the natural world." This observation fueled his subsequent pamphlet, Lettres à l'Académie de Lyon, where he argued that the Jesuits' emphasis on rote memorization stifled intellectual growth. The Jesuit response, published under a pseudonym, defended their pedagogical approach as essential for moral formation. The back and forth illustrates how direct observation, personal experience, and public debate intertwined, shaping Voltaire's critique of education, and by extension, his broader arguments for intellectual freedom. The impact of Voltaire's network can also be traced in the way his ideas were received and adapted by later thinkers. The French revolutionary philosopher Henri Grégoire, for example, cited Voltaire's arguments for religious tolerance in his 1790 pamphlet De la Liberté de Conscience. Grégoire wrote, "Voltaire's lamp has illuminated the path to a secular republic, where conscience is free from the shackles of clerical authority." This lineage demonstrates how Voltaire's friendships and feuds did not remain confined to his own era, but echoed through subsequent generations, informing debates about the separation of church and state that continue to this day. When we examine the broader cultural milieu, we see that Voltaire's network was part of a larger transformation of communication. The rise of coffee houses, the proliferation of print, and the emergence of a literate bourgeois public created a fertile ground for the exchange of ideas. In this environment, the Republic of Letters functioned as both a metaphor and a concrete institution. Voltaire's letters traveled across borders, his pamphlets were read aloud in taverns, his plays were performed on stages from Paris to Berlin. The circulation of his works created a feedback loop. Public reception influenced his subsequent writings, which in turn reshaped public opinion. This dynamic is evident in the way the Candide controversy unfolded. After its publication, readers in England and Germany praised its wit, while French censors condemned its perceived irreverence. Voltaire, aware of these divergent reactions, issued a revised edition that softened some of the more overt attacks on the church, demonstrating his responsiveness to the public sphere's pressures. The role of the salon as a microcosm of the public sphere cannot be overstated. Salons provided the intimate setting where philosophical arguments could be tested before an audience that combined aristocrats, bourgeois intellectuals, and sometimes even women of influence. Madame de Tencин's salon, for instance, hosted a memorable evening in 1755 where Voltaire, Diderot, and the young writer Madame du Deffand debated the merits of religious tolerance. The conversation, recorded by a contemporary observer, unfolded as follows. Voltaire argued, "Tolerance is the soil in which reason can grow," while Diderot countered, "Reason alone is insufficient. We must also cultivate virtue." Madame du Deffand, known for her sharp wit, interjected, "Perhaps the garden of tolerance must be tended by both the philosopher and the poet." This anecdote illustrates how the salon served as a laboratory for synthesizing diverse perspectives, allowing Voltaire to refine his arguments in the presence of critical interlocutors. In the later years of his life, as Voltaire settled in Geneva, his network evolved yet again. He maintained correspondence with the British writer Thomas Paine, whose common sense would later inspire revolutionary sentiment in America. In a letter dated 1775, Voltaire praised Paine's clarity, writing, "Your words cut through the fog of oppression with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel." Paine, in turn, acknowledged Voltaire's influence on his own thinking about religious liberty. This transatlantic exchange underscores the enduring relevance of Voltaire's ideas and the way his network continued to adapt to new political contexts, even as the original salon culture waned. The juxtaposition of Voltaire's friendships and feuds also reveals a pattern of intellectual reciprocity. While his alliance with Frederick the Great yielded concrete policy recommendations, his rivalry with Rousseau forced him to confront the limits of rationalism. The Jesuit controversy, meanwhile, highlighted how critique could be wielded as a tool for societal reform, even as it risked alienating potential allies. These dynamics demonstrate that the Republic of Letters was not a static institution, but a living ecosystem, constantly reshaped by the personalities that inhabited it. Voltaire's ability to navigate this ecosystem, leveraging friendships for strategic advantage, engaging in public disputes to sharpen his arguments, and absorbing criticism to refine his ideas, was central to his enduring impact. In reflecting on the legacy of this network, we must also acknowledge the voices that have been marginalized within the historical record. Women such as Madame Geoffrin, Madame du Deffand, and the Duchess of Nivernais played crucial roles as facilitators of dialogue, yet their contributions are often eclipsed by the more flamboyant male philosophers. Their salons provided the spaces where ideas could be aired, debated, and disseminated. The fact that Voltaire's most celebrated anecdotes often involve male counterparts should not obscure the broader collaborative environment that made his work possible. Recognizing these contributions deepens our understanding of the Republic of Letters as a more inclusive, albeit still imperfect, arena for intellectual exchange. Finally, let us return to the central question. How did these friendships, feuds, and the broader public sphere shape Voltaire's thought? The answer lies in the interplay of personal experience, strategic alliance, and public engagement. The meeting with Frederick the Great taught Voltaire that enlightened despotism could be a vehicle for reform, prompting a turn toward pragmatic proposals in his later writings. The feud with Rousseau sharpened his defense of reason, leading to more incisive satire and a heightened awareness of the emotional dimensions of human experience. The Jesuit controversy demonstrated the power of public pamphleteering to mobilize opinion and influence policy, reinforcing his belief in the importance of a vibrant public sphere. And the salon culture, with its blend of intimacy and intellectual rigor, provided the testing ground where ideas could be refined before they entered the broader public arena. Together, these elements formed a complex feedback loop that continuously reshaped Voltaire's philosophy, ensuring that his work remained both responsive to his times and resonant for future generations. In sum, Voltaire's network was a tapestry woven from threads of camaraderie, rivalry, collaboration, and critique. It spanned continents, crossed disciplinary boundaries, and engaged with the emergent public sphere that Habermas later described. The vivid anecdotes of his meeting with Frederick at Sanssouci and his public quarrel with Rousseau over a mile serve as focal points that illuminate the broader dynamics at play. Counterarguments from Rousseau and modern revisionist scholars remind us that the story is not one of unqualified triumph, but of contested influence and nuanced interaction. By tracing these relationships, we gain a richer, more textured portrait of Voltaire, not as a solitary genius, but as an active participant in a vibrant republic of letters that helped shape the modern world. The echoes of his friendships, feuds, and the salons that hosted them continue to reverberate, inviting us to consider how our own networks of ideas might shape the philosophies of our time. When we turn our gaze toward the long, winding road that stretches from the salons of 18th-century Paris to the bustling streets of modern protest movements, we find Voltaire's voice echoing, sometimes clearly, sometimes as a faint reverberation, across centuries and continents. It is tempting to reduce his legacy to a handful of witty maxims. "I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," or "all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds." Yet such reduction would betray the depth of his influence on secularism, human rights, and the very shape of the French Revolution itself. In this segment, we will wander through the corridors of his thought, pause at the doors of his most consequential ideas, and step into the rooms where those ideas have been reshaped, challenged, and reimagined in the present day. Voltaire, born François-Marie Arouet in 1694, entered the world at a moment when the old order of divine right monarchies and Catholic orthodoxy still held sway, but the first tremors of a new rationalist spirit were already stirring. His early encounters with the Jesuit education system left him both impressed by the power of classical learning and deeply skeptical of the dogmatic authority that seemed to choke it. The famous anecdote of his expulsion from the college Louis le Grand after a dispute with the headmaster over a Latin translation of a poem. "The school demanded that I write a poem in the style of Horace, but I answered with a satire that mocked the very notion of unquestioned authority," illustrates how his formative years were already a crucible in which the twin fires of wit and dissent were forged. This personal experience of institutional oppression would later become a cornerstone of his relentless campaign against censorship and religious intolerance. The Enlightenment, that great intellectual movement that championed reason, progress, and the public sphere, found in Voltaire one of its most prolific and charismatic spokespeople. Unlike his contemporary Rousseau, who emphasized the natural goodness of man and the corrupting influence of society, Voltaire placed his faith in the power of critical inquiry and the corrective force of free expression. In his prolific correspondence, over 20,000 letters spanning decades, he argued that the only way to secure liberty is to make it a habit of questioning, to make it a habit of listening, and above all, a habit of speaking. It is this habit, cultivated in the coffee houses of Paris and later in the pamphlet wars of revolutionary France, that seeded the modern conception of secular public discourse. Secularism, as we understand it today, is not simply the removal of religion from the public sphere. It is the creation of a neutral arena where citizens of diverse beliefs can engage in shared decision-making without the weight of theological authority. Voltaire's relentless attacks on the Church's monopoly over knowledge, most famously in his treatise on tolerance, 1763, and the scandalous Philosophical Dictionary, provided a template for this secular ideal. He famously wrote, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him," a paradoxical statement that underscored his belief that religious belief, when wielded as a tool of power, could be as dangerous as any tyrant. By exposing the absurdities of superstitions and the injustices of clerical privilege, he helped to carve out a space where reason could stand on its own, unshackled from the constraints of doctrinal authority. The influence of this secular vision can be traced directly to the revolutionary assemblies of 1789. While Voltaire did not live to see the storming of the Bastille, his writings were on the shelves of the National Assembly, quoted in debates, and cited in the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The very phrase liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression echoes his insistence that the state must protect the individual's freedom of thought and expression. In the famous Article 10 of the Declaration, which guarantees freedom of thought and opinion, we hear Voltaire's voice resonating. The law should protect the right of every man to think, to speak, and to write. The French Revolution, with all its contradictions and excesses, nonetheless carried forward Voltaire's conviction that the state's legitimacy rests upon its respect for the autonomy of the mind. From the French Revolution, Voltaire's ideas leapt across the Atlantic, finding fertile ground in the nascent United States. The American founding fathers were avid readers of French Enlightenment literature, and Voltaire's works were among the most widely circulated. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, owned a copy of Voltaire's Candide and referenced his criticism of religious intolerance in private correspondence with James Madison. Jefferson's famous Letter to the Danbury Baptists, 1802, which introduced the phrase "wall of separation between church and state," can be seen as an American echo of Voltaire's call for a public sphere free from clerical domination. Moreover, the drafting of the First Amendment, enshrining freedom of speech and religion, bears the imprint of Voltaire's relentless advocacy for the right to dissent. The phrase "the liberty of conscience" that appears in the amendment's text mirrors his insistence that the true liberty of a people consists in their having the power to discuss and to decide upon any subject without fear of reprisal. In contemporary times, Voltaire's quotations have become rallying cries for human rights campaigns that span the globe. Consider the 2022 campaign by Amnesty International to defend the right of journalists in authoritarian regimes. Their promotional videos opened with a stark black screen, followed by the words, "I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," attributed to Voltaire. The simple, resonant power of that sentence galvanized a worldwide audience, reminding us that the defense of free speech is not a modern invention, but a principle with deep historical roots. Similarly, the United Nations Human Rights Council, during its 2023 session on the protection of minority religions, quoted Voltaire's admonition that the intolerance of the mind is the greatest danger to liberty. By invoking his voice, modern institutions signal a continuity of moral commitment that stretches back over 3 centuries. Yet, as we celebrate this legacy, we must also turn a critical eye toward the limitations and blind spots embedded within Voltaire's Enlightenment universalism. Post-colonial theorists such as Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak have argued that the Enlightenment's claim to universal reason often concealed a Eurocentric worldview that justified the domination of non-European peoples. Voltaire, despite his championing of tolerance, was not immune to these currents. In his Letter to the Jews, 1762, he wrote that the Jews are a people who have been condemned to a perpetual exile and who are forever a nuisance to the rest of mankind. Such statements reveal a paradox. While decrying the tyranny of the Church, he nonetheless reproduced the same hierarchical attitudes toward those outside the European cultural sphere. The critique deepens when we examine Voltaire's engagement with the Atlantic slave trade. In his philosophical dictionary, he denounced the cruelty of slavery, yet he also defended the French colonial project in the Caribbean, arguing that the presence of the French in the West Indies is a civilizing mission that brings order and progress. This ambivalence is precisely what post-colonial scholars highlight. The Enlightenment's rhetoric of universal liberty was often applied selectively, extending its embrace only to those who could be assimilated into the European rational order. The result, they argue, is a philosophical foundation that, while opening doors for certain freedoms, also erected walls that excluded entire peoples. Feminist scholars, too, have taken up the task of interrogating Voltaire's treatment of gender. While he praised the intellectual capabilities of women in private letters, once telling Madame de Pompadour, "Your wit rivals that of any man in the salon," he nevertheless upheld the prevailing patriarchal norms of his day. In his play Oedipus, for instance, he portrays the female character Jocasta as a tragic figure whose fate is sealed by the actions of men, reinforcing the notion that women are passive actors in the grand drama of history. Moreover, his famous quip, "Women are not born to be philosophers," though perhaps intended as a sarcastic provocation, has been seized by feminist historians as evidence of the limits of his progressive stance. The tension between his advocacy for intellectual freedom and his acceptance of gendered hierarchies invites us to ask, can we celebrate his contributions without glossing over the ways in which his vision of universal rights fell short of inclusivity? These critical perspectives do not diminish Voltaire's achievements, but they compel us to adopt a more nuanced view, one that acknowledges both the illumination he provided and the shadows he left behind. In the practice of contemporary philosophy and activism, this dual awareness becomes a guiding principle. When we invoke Voltaire to defend free speech, we must also ask whether the very platforms we defend are accessible to all voices, especially those historically marginalized. When we cite his arguments for religious tolerance, we must consider whether the secular public sphere he imagined is truly neutral, or whether it subtly privileges a particular rationalist worldview that can marginalize non-Western epistemologies. Linking Voltaire's ideas to current debates on free speech, religious tolerance, and scientific rationalism requires us to translate his 18th century arguments into the language of 21st century dilemmas. Take the question of online platforms and the regulation of hate speech. Voltaire's insistence that the right to think, to speak, and to write must be protected, even when the ideas expressed are odious, resonates with the arguments of contemporary libertarians who warn against the chilling effect of overbroad moderation. Yet his own experience with the censorship of his pamphlets, his letters concerning the English nation, were seized, his Candide was banned in several French provinces, reminds us that the balance between protecting speech and preventing harm is a delicate, historically contingent negotiation. In the realm of religious tolerance, the resurgence of identity politics and the rise of nationalist movements that conflate religion with cultural belonging present a fresh challenge. Voltaire's critique of the Church's interference in state affairs can be extended to critique the modern entanglement of religious identity with political power. When a government enacts laws that privilege one religious tradition over others, the spirit of Voltaire's treatise on tolerance calls us to demand a neutral civic space where no belief system is granted preferential treatment. Yet we must also heed the post-colonial warning that secularism, if imposed unilaterally, can become a new form of cultural domination, particularly when it dismisses the lived religious experiences of minority communities as irrational or backward. Scientific rationalism, perhaps the most enduring of Voltaire's legacies, finds its contemporary champion in the new atheism movement, epitomized by figures such as Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. These thinkers often quote Voltaire as a forebear of their own critique of religious dogma, invoking his famous line, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him." The new atheists argue that the same rationalist spirit that propelled the Enlightenment should now be applied to dismantle superstition in the age of biotechnology, climate change denial, and pseudoscience. However, even within this movement, scholars have begun to critique the uncritical appropriation of Voltaire's legacy, noting that the Enlightenment's confidence in reason sometimes blinds its adherents to the social and cultural dimensions of belief. The philosopher Charles Taylor, for instance, warns that an exclusively rationalist discourse can marginalize the narrative imagination that gives meaning to human life, echoing the feminist and post-colonial concerns we have already raised. Cross-referencing Voltaire with later philosophers deepens our appreciation of how his ideas have been transformed. Immanuel Kant, writing in the wake of the French Revolution, famously articulated the principle of moral autonomy. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Kant's categorical imperative can be read as a systematic philosophical grounding of the very liberty that Voltaire championed in a more rhetorical, pamphleteer style. While Voltaire appealed to the public sense of justice and common sense, Kant offered a rigorous moral calculus that sought to universalize the principles of freedom and respect. The dialogue between their works illustrates an evolution from the Enlightenment's call for tolerance to the Enlightenment's attempt to codify it within a deontological framework. John Stuart Mill, writing a century later, would take Voltaire's defense of free speech and embed it within a utilitarian calculus. In his essay on liberty, Mill famously argued that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Mill's harm principle can be seen as a refinement of Voltaire's more expansive claim that all ideas, however offensive, deserve protection. Mill recognized that an unrestricted marketplace of ideas could, in some cases, produce harm, and thus he introduced a nuanced boundary that still honors the spirit of Voltaire's advocacy. The intellectual lineage from Voltaire to Mill underscores a continuous negotiation between liberty and responsibility, a negotiation that remains at the heart of contemporary debates over platform governance, hate speech, and the limits of expression. When we consider concrete modern examples, the resonance of Voltaire's ideas becomes palpable. In 2021, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in the case of MSV France that a French politician's public criticism of Islam, which had been prosecuted under hate speech laws, was protected as a form of political speech. The majority opinion cited Voltaire's legacy, noting that the defense of the right to criticize religious doctrine is essential to the maintenance of a free and open society. The court's reliance on Voltaire's principle that the liberty of the mind is the most precious of all freedoms demonstrates how his 18th century writings continue to shape jurisprudence in the 21st century. Another vivid illustration comes from the global climate justice movement. In 2023, the youth-led organization Fridays for Future organized a worldwide campaign titled Reason Over Ritual. The campaign's slogan, a direct echo of Voltaire's insistence on rational inquiry, was accompanied by a poster that juxtaposed a candlelit church with a solar panel, captioned, "Let the light of reason guide us, not the darkness of superstition." The organizers explicitly referenced Voltaire's critique of the tyranny of the clergy, framing the fight against climate change as a battle not only against corporate interests, but also against the inertia of religious fatalism that, in some regions, discourages scientific engagement. By invoking Voltaire, the movement positioned itself within a lineage of rationalist activism, suggesting that the fight for a sustainable future is, at its core, a continuation of the Enlightenment's quest for progress through reason. These examples show that Voltaire's ideas are not static relics, but living tools that activists and jurists adapt to new challenges. Yet, the very process of adaptation invites us to ask how faithfully we are preserving his intent and where we might be reshaping his thought to serve contemporary agendas. For instance, when corporations brand themselves as Voltaire-inspired for marketing campaigns that promote freedom of choice in consumer goods, they risk trivializing the political radicalism that underpinned his critique of state and church power. The danger, as post-colonial scholars warn, is that the veneer of universalism can be co-opted to mask hegemonic interests, turning the language of liberty into a tool of market domination. In navigating these complexities, we can draw on a set of practical guidelines for linking Voltaire's ideas to present-day debates. First, when invoking his defense of free speech, acknowledge the historical context of his battles against censorship and pair his argument with a contemporary commitment to inclusive platforms that amplify marginalized voices. Second, when citing his advocacy for religious tolerance, emphasize the distinction he made between the freedom to hold beliefs and the rejection of institutional power that enforces orthodoxy, thereby supporting policies that protect both secularism and the right of religious minorities to practice their faith without coercion. Third, in discussions of scientific rationalism, use Voltaire's critique of superstition as a springboard for promoting evidence-based policy, while remaining attentive to the critique that rationalism must not become a monolithic cultural imperialism that dismisses alternative epistemologies. A useful analogy can help us visualize this balancing act. Imagine Voltaire's ideas as a compass that points toward the magnetic north of liberty and reason. The compass is a reliable instrument, but it does not guarantee that the traveler will avoid all obstacles. The terrain, filled with mountains of prejudice, valleys of economic disparity, and rivers of cultural difference, requires additional tools, maps that incorporate local knowledge, boots that can navigate steep inclines, and a willingness to adjust the course when the compass points toward a cliff. In the same way, we must employ Voltaire's compass while supplementing it with the insights of post-colonial theory, feminist critique, and contemporary social science, ensuring that our journey toward a more just society does not crash against the hidden rocks of unexamined assumptions. Historical anecdotes further illuminate the potency of Voltaire's influence. One story tells of the French diplomat and writer Turgot, who, during a heated debate in the Estates General of 1789, quoted Voltaire's Candide to mock the aristocracy's claim to divine right. He held up the book and declared, "If we are to be guided by the best of all possible worlds, then let us also be guided by the best of all possible reason." The crowd erupted, and the moment is said to have crystallized a collective yearning for a rational reordering of society. Another anecdote concerns the American abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who, in an 1831 speech to a Philadelphia audience, cited Voltaire's condemnation of religious hypocrisy as a justification for his own crusade against slavery. If the priest can be a tyrant, then the master can be no less so. Let us, therefore, demand the same liberty for all men that Voltaire demanded for the mind. Garrison's invocation of Voltaire demonstrates how the French philosopher's critique of institutional oppression transcended national borders and was repurposed to challenge the most entrenched forms of human exploitation. Even in the realm of literature, Voltaire's shadow looms large. The Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, in his diary entry of 1865, reflected on the courage of Voltaire to speak truth to power as an inspiration for his own moral struggle against the autocratic Tsarist regime. Tolstoy's own advocacy for non-violent resistance, later echoed by Gandhi, can be traced back to this lineage of moral fortitude. In a more recent literary context, the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda referenced Voltaire in his poem, "The Earth is a Small House," writing, "We inherit the light of Voltaire's lamp, but we must not let it dim in the darkness of our own making." This poetic homage underscores how Voltaire's Enlightenment continues to illuminate artistic expressions of social conscience. Turning now to the practical realm of education and public discourse, we can consider how teachers and communicators might integrate Voltaire's ideas into curricula that address contemporary issues. A classroom discussion on the limits of free speech could begin with a reading of Voltaire's Letter on Tolerance, followed by a debate on current cases such as the removal of controversial statues or the regulation of extremist content online. By juxtaposing Voltaire's 18th century arguments with modern legal precedents, students can see the continuity and evolution of the principle. Similarly, a public lecture on secularism could trace the trajectory from Voltaire's attacks on the Jesuits to the modern French law of 2004, which bans conspicuous religious symbols in public schools. The lecturer could then invite participants to consider whether such policies truly embody Voltaire's vision, or whether they inadvertently impose a new form of uniformity that marginalizes certain religious identities. In the digital age, the way we disseminate Voltaire's quotes also merits reflection. The proliferation of meme culture, where a single witty line is paired with a striking image and shared millions of times, can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it democratizes access to philosophical ideas, allowing a teenager in Nairobi to encounter the same aphorism that once circulated in Parisian salons. On the other hand, the reduction of complex arguments to bite-sized soundbites can strip away nuance, leading to superficial appropriation. As communicators, we should strive to accompany Voltaire's memorable phrases with contextual explanations that highlight both their historical significance and their contemporary relevance, thereby honoring the depth of his thought while harnessing the reach of modern media. The dialogue between Voltaire and contemporary movements such as New Atheism also raises questions about the role of humor in philosophical discourse. Voltaire's satirical style, sharp, ironic, often bordering on the absurd, served as a weapon against dogma. In Candide, the relentless misfortunes of the protagonist become a parody of Leibnizian optimism, forcing readers to confront the gap between philosophical abstraction and lived suffering. New atheists, too, employ humor and satire to undermine religious claims, often through viral videos or podcasts that blend scientific exposition with witty banter. Yet critics argue that humor can sometimes obscure the gravity of the issues at stake, turning profound ethical concerns into mere entertainment. This tension invites us to consider how we might balance the persuasive power of satire with the responsibility to engage earnestly with the moral dimensions of belief and doubt. Finally, let us contemplate the future trajectory of Voltaire's legacy. As artificial intelligence reshapes the landscape of knowledge production, the question of who controls the narratives of truth becomes ever more pressing. Voltaire's insistence that the public must be free to hear the truth, however it may be uncomfortable, challenges us to ensure that AI systems do not become new gatekeepers of information, silencing dissenting voices under the guise of algorithmic neutrality. In this sense, the Enlightenment's call for a public sphere governed by reason finds a new arena in the digital commons, where the stakes of censorship, misinformation, and epistemic injustice are amplified. By invoking Voltaire's spirit, we can advocate for transparent, accountable AI that upholds the principle that every individual should have the right to think, speak, and write without undue restriction. In sum, the legacy of Voltaire is a tapestry woven from threads of daring critique, relentless advocacy for liberty, and, inevitably, the blind spots of his historical moment. His influence on secularism and human rights reverberates through the French Revolution, the American founding documents, and the global human rights movement. Contemporary activists and jurists still quote his words to defend free expression, while scholars of post-colonialism and feminism remind us that his universalism was, at times, a veil for Eurocentric and patriarchal assumptions. By engaging with his ideas alongside the moral autonomy of Kant, the liberty of Mill, and the rationalist fervor of New Atheism, we can construct a richer, more critical appreciation of what it means to champion reason in an age of pluralistic identities and complex technological challenges. As we close this exploration, let us keep in mind Voltaire's own counsel: judge a man by his questions rather than by his answers. In our present moment, the questions we ask about the limits of speech, the shape of secular public life, the inclusivity of rational discourse, are the true measure of how we carry forward his legacy. May our inquiries be as bold as his pamphlets, as compassionate as his pleas for tolerance, and as reflective as the quiet moments when we pause to consider the weight of a single, enduring idea.